Honor among Thieves 1. Black Nail woke up the next morning to the feeling of someone beating him savagely. He twitched and gasped as waves of pain exploded through his head and stomach. The stabbing agony in his skull hurt so much he could barely think, and his stomach felt like it was trying to explode messily out of both ends of his body at the same time. He had no idea what he'd done to deserve this torture. The goblin tried to remember if he had done anything wrong, but he couldn't recall anything bad. In fact, he couldn't remember much of anything. He fought through the pain and slowly opened his eyes. At first the light blinded his eyes and it took a while for them to adjust. Why was it so bright out? Was he outside the sewer? He never left the sewer during the day. He hoped he hadn't been attacked by a goblin, or group of goblins, looking to take his position in the tribe again. He was one of the older goblins and had managed to fight his way up to a fairly high rank, although he had been too lazy to go all the way to the top and become the tribe chief. Black Nail knew he was much tougher than the big nasty goblin that was the current chieftain. He just didn't want to fight him. Some of the younger goblins had been getting uppity lately though, and food had been running a bit low. The sewer could only support so many goblins. Through the fingers shielding his face, Black Nail took a quick look around for his assailants. He was outside and there was nobody around. Had his attackers left? Just then he had to double over and gag as his guts writhed like they were full of snakes. Oh, there they were. His assailants were apparently inside of him and beating him from the inside out. The goblin groaned and tried desperately to fade back into unconsciousness, where the pain couldn't follow. His futile attempt at slumber was interrupted as he felt a hand grab his neck and pull him into the air. He was too weak to try and fight it. All he could do was moan and flail weakly before giving up and going limp. What the heck was going on? He couldn't remember where he was. He hoped his death would at least be quick. The hand suddenly let go of him and Black Nail landed painfully on something flat and solid made of rough wood. The impact shook him and cleared his head for a second. His name was Black Nail. He had a name. He remembered where he was. Surely, the forest had to have been a bad dream. The part with the spiders was just too horrible to have been real. Black Nail sat up unsteadily and looked around. He was sitting on the edge of one of the wagons the bandits had taken from the caravan. His master Cedar towered over him, casting his shadow over the goblin. "Good morning, Black Nail." Cedar smugly greeted him as the goblin looked up. "Ow," Black Nail then moaned as he tried to curl up into a ball again. Cedar chuckled and pulled him back into a sitting position. Once he knew he had the goblin's attention, he started talking. "That should teach you that alcohol isn't for goblins," Cedar told the goblin. "Ow," Black Nail grunted. "Stay here in the wagon, Black Nail. I left some food and water out for you. I'll be back in a while to see if you're feeling better," Cedar told the disoriented goblin. His master then went through his bags before leaving the goblin and walking away. With a groan, Black Nail collapsed back onto the wagon's deck. After a few minutes of suffering, he heard the whinny of horses and the cart shook and started moving. So, Black Nail once again found himself riding on a bumpy wagon along the forest road. At least this time he wasn't stuck in a cage. It was still the worst day in his entire life, though. He felt sicker and more uncomfortable than he had ever been before, which was saying something considering he used to live in a sewer and eat garbage. He lay beside Cedar's possessions feeling like his stomach was full of live rats and someone was pounding on his head with a club. The wagon creaked and bumped beneath him and every once in a while he would groan in pain. Actually, he had much preferred it when he'd been in the cage. Why did humans drink something that was so obviously poisonous? He had eaten rotten fish heads that agreed with him more, and they had tasted better as well. Maybe it was some sort of weird human test of toughness. He guessed that meant he would have passed? Well, if it was a test of intelligence, he'd definitely failed. At least his master had left him plenty of water and food. Not that he felt like eating. All he could do was lay there moaning and hoping he would recover before he died, or before death started to look good compared to this endless suffering. The humans had taken most of the boxes and goods they had stolen from the caravan and put them back on the wagons. The outlaws had then broken camp and packed up their own stuff. Before the sun had truly risen into the sky, they were on their way, headed down the road the way the caravan had been going. Most of the humans walked beside the wagons piled high with boxes. All the wagons had drivers and several humans rode in the back like Black Nail. Most of the passengers seemed to have been wounded because they wore bandages or were missing some of their less important human bits. Humans probably didn't need all their fingers and it wasn't like their tiny ears did much anyway. It took several hours of rough traveling for Black Nail to finally start feeling better. He managed to sit up and eat some of the gruel his master had left him. It felt good to put something in his stomach and he soon regained some energy. The goblin actually started to enjoy sitting on the back of the wagon with his feet dangling off the edge as he watched all the trees go by. Being on the road was certainly a lot better than being in the forest. Now that his head was clear, he definitely remembered that the harpies and timber spiders were very real. He hoped he was leaving them behind forever, but he kind of doubted it. Life didn't work that way in his experience. Black Nail managed to find another way to spend his time. He enjoyed standing at the side of the wagon and looking down, barely, on all the foolish humans who were walking behind the wagons. He bet they all wished they could ride the wagon like him. He giggled to himself in amusement. Look, there was Geralt. He already looked exhausted, sweaty, and miserable. He waved to the man cheerfully, but Geralt didn't see him. Black Nail's fun was interrupted when Cedar returned. The goblin didn't hear his master approach. He was too preoccupied hanging off the side of the wagon and snickering at people when he heard a loud cough behind him. The goblin turned around to see an amused Cedar looking back. Black Nail froze in surprise. He tried to remember if he had done anything wrong lately. Nope, he was pretty sure he had always done exactly as his master commanded. He was a good goblin after all. Well, you're looking much better, right? Full of energy too. That's good, you're gonna need it, Cedar told the goblin. Oh, Black Nail didn't like the sound of that. Since you're feeling better now, you can continue practicing your rope making. You'll find the stuff in that bag there, Cedar explained as he pointed out a canvas bag. Black Nail gave the bag a wary look. That sounded very boring, but at least he didn't have to go out into the forest. I expect to see some results when I get back, Cedar told him. He then jumped onto the wagon beside the goblin and rummaged through the bags for some things before jumping down and wandering off again. Black Nail watched him go with a sigh of resignation. Ugh, rope making. He didn't even want to hear about something so boring, let alone actually do it. After pulling the necessary materials from the bag his master had pointed out, the goblin got to work. Black Nail cast a gloomy gaze over to the humans walking behind the wagon. He wished he was free to just walk around like them and not have to work. The goblin started at it, but after an hour or so he started to grow weary of the incredibly repetitive task. With a snort of disgust, Black Nail dropped the cord he was working on onto the deck of the wagon. He was so bored. It was time to take a break. There had to be something around that would amuse him, at least for a little bit. He got to his feet and looked around, while being careful that the shaking of the wagon under him didn't trip him up. Black Nail was surrounded by bags and crates. With a quick glance to make sure no one was looking, the goblin scooted over and began to examine them. He opened one canvas bag and riffled through it, but found nothing but human-sized clothes inside. Why did humans need so many clothes? What possible use could they have for more than 1 or 2 sets each? He closed that bag and hurriedly moved on to the next. He found nothing but some sweet-smelling ground-up plant leaves in it. Black Nail was beginning to think that the bandits had to be a little off in the head to have attacked a caravan for this crap. None of it was even shiny. With a sigh, Black Nail got back to work on making cord until the wagon stopped and the bandits made camp for the night. It was then that he finally managed to weave a thin cord together. The goblin then amused himself by tying it to various things and pulling on it. It didn't even break. He felt so proud to have made it. Cedar then reappeared and Black Nail excitedly helped him set up his tent. The goblin just had to untangle himself from all the rope he'd tied to the wagon first. Not his best idea, but at least the cord worked. After they had a fire going and supper was cooking, Cedar presented Black Nail with several rabbits he had caught earlier. Disappointingly, Black Nail didn't get to eat them. His master had him learn to skin and prepare them. He was taught how to drain the blood by cutting their throats, peel the skin off, cut out the groin area, and slice open the bellies of rabbits to remove the organs. The cheerful goblin picked up this skill quickly and he soon ran out of carcasses to work on. He enjoyed the work, but it seemed like a lot of effort when you could just eat the rabbit raw. As the evening gave way to night, he slept beside his master's tent again with his dirty blanket wrapped around himself and the stars shining in the dark sky overhead. Owls and other creatures he couldn't identify called throughout the night, but eventually Black Nail managed to slip asleep despite his nervousness. The next morning Cedar took Black Nail with him when he was sent out to prepare a forward base well ahead of the main group. Cedar, Black Nail, and several other bandits who were familiar with the forest spent numerous days quickly getting ahead of the rest of the band. They walked almost constantly during the day with only a few stops to collect water or eat. They didn't have time to hunt, so they had to make do with the rations they carried. At night they set up camp in the middle of the road and took turns keeping watch. Black Nail was not given a shift. The sound of howling woke Black Nail on the second day. It echoed loudly through the trees around him and down the road. The eerie howling reverberated through the forest. It would suddenly come from one direction only for the noise to die down and then pick up from another direction. Black Nail was just glad that the howlers sounded too far away to be a real threat. Soon the noise drew Cedar out from his tent. After a second of listening, the old scout turned to the goblin. Wolves, I showed you their tracks earlier. Don't worry, they're just gossiping, Cedar told Black Nail with an uncharacteristic peaceful smile. He then stretched, closed his eyes, and took a few more seconds to listen. Beautiful, the sound of the north, he whispered to himself. The goblin didn't understand. Wolves were the dog things, right? He closed his eyes and listened as well, focusing on the sound of wolves over the forest. All the noise did, however, was fill him with wariness. Soon the noise began to fade away, and Black Nail felt an unexpected twinge of regret. For a quick second the howling had seemed oddly familiar. It made no sense, but for some reason it had reminded him of home. After a quick tasty breakfast the bandits hit the road again. They turned off the main road and moved on to what could charitably be called a forest route. It was really a dirt path barely wide enough for a single wagon, and it was very bumpy. Black Nail didn't like this new path much. The trees loomed much closer along its narrower confines. As usual, that night they set up camp and posted a watch. Feeling somewhat excluded since he wasn't given a turn, Black Nail decided to stay up and help his master during his turn. After a brief supper and conversation around the fire, everyone turned in for bed. This time, however, Black Nail forced himself to stay awake and wait. It was a dark, moonless night. Clouds covered most of the sky. Outside the light of the fire everything was pitch black. Only the dark outlines of trees could be seen shifting at the furthest reaches of the firelight. By the time it was Cedar's watch, the fire was dying down and Black Nail amused himself for a few minutes by throwing some more wood on it and watching the sparks fly up into the dark sky. The heat from the fire soon made him drowsy though, so he curled up beside it. The last thing he saw before nodding off was Cedar's back as his master stood at the edge of the light and gazed calmly out into the darkness. He tried again each night, but Black Nail never managed to stay awake for any of Cedar's watches. The closest the goblin ever came was when he awoke suddenly one night several days later with an uneasy feeling eating at his guts. One second he was asleep and the next he was awake and on guard. He didn't know why, but he knew something had disturbed him, something dangerous. The goblin's ears twitched as he listened and he automatically sniffed the air quietly. He sensed nothing. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked around. Somehow he knew something was there even if he couldn't see or smell it. The fire was very low, only a few slow-burning coals were left smoldering. Most the humans were asleep around it with their bags and equipment beside them. Only one of the bandits was on watch and he was seated on a rock beside the fire drinking a cup of tea. He was obviously only barely paying attention to the area around himself. There was only a small sliver of moon in the sky but no clouds concealed it. Thus, there was enough light for Black Nail to see his surroundings fairly well. His amazing goblin night vision was much better than that of a mere human. The pale moonlit road stretched off into the shadowy trees to one side of him. Their group was camped on a hill beside it where the wind helped keep the mosquitoes away. To Black Nail's eyes, the hill floated like an island atop a dark pool of trees that shook and creaked in the wind like waves on black water. He knew something lurked down there in the depths of the forest, watching him. Other than the wind and the rustling of leaves it was a quiet night though, too quiet. Alarmed, Black Nail realized he didn't hear the usual sounds of night birds and prowling animals. That was a bad sign, very bad. The goblin peered out into the darkness-drenched forest for the danger he could somehow sense but not identify. He heard leaves crunch off to one side and he quickly whirled around. However, the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Black Nail froze and eyed the trees and bushes in that direction carefully but the forest concealed what lay within it too well for him to see anything. The sound of the goblin's heartbeat grew louder in his ears. He knew something terrible was about to happen, but all he could do was stare into the impenetrable shadows before him. His anxiety began to wear him down as he grew twitchier and he started to get a pounding headache. The nearby leaves shook as something large moved within them. The shadows convulsed around it and Black Nail hissed loudly in alarm. Out from the darkness an answering low predatory growl erupted. Its force sent leaves and other debris fluttering forth into the camp from the forest. Black Nail's hackles rose and his body tensed as the smell of the creature's breath washed over him. He had never smelled anything like it. With an alarmed look, the man by the fire shot to his feet and drew his sword. He hurried over to Black Nail's side. "Do you see anything, Goblin?" the swordsman asked Black Nail as he scanned the edge of the firelight. The man's voice quivered with unease and his face looked white in moonlight. Clearly, he had been spooked by the noise, and Black Nail didn't blame him. The goblin shook his head in answer to the man's question. The commotion woke some of the other men including Cedar who sat up and automatically reached for his bow and quiver. Slowly, Black Nail's master got to his feet and drew his bow. Nothing happened for a few stagnant seconds. Black Nail heard more of the men get to their feet and arm themselves. He really wished they would hurry up. Black Nail twitched again as the sound of leaves and twigs being crunched by something heavy out in the darkness reached his ears. Whatever the thing in the woods was, it had started moving again. Black Nail's skin crawled and he felt a spike of terror tear through his heart. He heard the sounds of blades being drawn and deep steady breaths as the men behind him readied themselves for combat with whatever horror was about to burst from the darkness upon them. The goblin got ready to run and hide behind them. Then, he realized the sound wasn't moving closer. It was moving further away. Slowly, the rhythmic noise got quieter until it was completely muffled by the forest. Only then did Black Nail relax and let out a deep breath. No one spoke for a few seconds. Most of the bandits had been awakened by the commotion. They threw each other nervous looks and held their weapons close. Then, Cedar broke the silence as he relaxed his bow. "It's gone. Make sure the man on watch stays alert and keeps the fire high. Scream loudly if something attacks you," Cedar said with a yawn as he settled back down to sleep. The man on watch gave Cedar an annoyed look and Black Nail gave his master a disbelieving one. How could he just go back to sleep? "What was it?" one of the bandits asked Cedar. Black Nail's master turned to them from where he lay on his blanket. "Dunno. Could have been an ogre taking a night stroll or a hungry drake that decided we weren't worth the trouble. Let's hope we never find out," Cedar replied crankily before then turning away and going back to sleep. Several of the other bandits whispered fearfully to each other for a few minutes before settling back down themselves. Black Nail lay back down by the remains of the fire but was too nervous to sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there and just waiting for them all to relax their guard. If it attacked them while they were asleep they wouldn't stand a chance. The terrible hungry beast would rip them apart and chew on their bones. Honor among thieves too. Black Nail didn't get a lot of sleep that night. Instead, he anxiously gazed out into the woods for any sign of the creature's return. Eventually though, exhaustion overcame his fear and he lost his hold on consciousness. He dreamed of dark waters and pale worms with toothy maws swimming beneath him in strange patterns. It was far from the best dream he'd ever had. The following morning he woke with a start but had only the faintest recollection of the visions that had disturbed his sleep. Black Nail was more than happy to let the memories slip from his mind as they once again got up and began walking. The group of bandits reached their destination around noon that day. The goblin was more than a little disappointed when he saw it. It was just a clearing along the abandoned road they'd been traveling on. Why had they walked so far just to move from one empty spot to another? Humans were stupid. The meadow was much larger than the one they had been camped in before and it contained a small derelict building. Those were the only real differences Black Nail could see. It was a solid-looking wooden building but it had clearly degraded over the years since it had been abandoned. The wooden door had fallen off and the thatch roof had long since rotted away. Black Nail stood off to the side of Cedar and listened in as he started talking to the other bandits. This used to be a farmhouse, and this overgrown meadow used to be farmland. When I was young homesteads like this dotted these lands. Now look at it, Cedar mused sorrowfully. Times are tough everywhere, Cedar. All the bloody kings and nobles have been at their damned pointless wars for decades now. At least up here in the north there are no press gangs and taxmen, one of the other scouts replied before spitting onto the ground. Cedar snorted disdainfully in response. No, there are only monsters, mutants, the city killer, and 1,000 other ways to die out here. Let's also not forget about all the merciless bandits and deprived outlaws, he countered with dark humor. Like I said, times are tough everywhere, the other replied simply with a shrug. Years of war will do that. The North would have toughed it out if not for the thrice-damned city killer, Cedar said with sudden heat that caused his face to flush with barely contained hatred. Black Nail almost took a step back from him in alarm. His master never showed his anger like that. He was usually so in control. It scared the goblin more than a little. He could too easily imagine that wild rage being turned against him. Well, I wasn't there so I wouldn't know, but I suspect you are wrong about that. Things would have been better here were Korayula still standing, but the rest of the world would have still dragged the North down with it, the other bandit replied carefully as he watched Cedar out of the corner of his eye. We would have had a chance, though, Cedar said as his anger gave way to resignation. Ha, I really must be becoming an old man because I'm starting to rant and grumble just like one. The other man just grunted in response and they both stared at the ruins in front of them for a while. Black Nail joined them but he didn't see anything interesting. Were they looking for something? After a few minutes they had to stop and help the other scouts work. Their group had a lot of work to do to get the new campsite ready for everyone else's arrival. First, they had to fix up the building up and clear the land. The tall grass and plants that grew in the clearing had to be cut and set out to dry in order to make thatch for the building's roof and to clear an area for camping. They also went to work cutting down some of the nearby trees and stockpiling the wood and branches for both fuel and construction materials. As they worked, one of the scouts stumbled upon an old well by the house. So they added repairing that to the list of things they needed to do. Luckily, they had over a dozen good workers and one over-enthusiastic goblin. As they worked and waited for Herat and the wagons, Cedar sent scouts out to watch the road. He wanted to keep in contact with Herat and make sure no one could sneak up on them unaware. Even once they had finished most of the original jobs, Black Nail was still kept busy helping his master with his usual duties once again. He ran about helping with hunting in the morning and chores in the afternoon. After several days of exploring the woods with Cedar, the goblin began to feel more comfortable out there. Being under the forest canopy wasn't so bad, as long as he stayed within 3 feet of his master at all times and didn't go anywhere too dark. The spiders lived in the gloom. He quickly picked up a lot of useful skills from doing so many chores every day. He was even rewarded with a small knife of his own. That was great because it showed that his master trusted him to be loyal, useful, and not to stab people. The first thing the goblin learned was how to set fires. Cedar showed him how to arrange the wood and tinder and set it alight with steel and flint, or by rubbing 2 pieces of wood together. A few impromptu fire-starting practice sessions later, Cedar snatched the flint and steel back. He then ordered the disappointed goblin not to practice anymore without permission. Black Nail didn't know what the big deal was. It had only been a small section of grass that had caught fire, and together all the scouts had managed to stamp it out easily enough. Next he was put to work skinning rabbits again. When he ran out of carcasses to practice on, Cedar took him out into the woods and showed him how to set the snares himself. He did this by bending a sapling down and tying it to a piece of cord with a noose on the end. A twig was tied to the cord right before the noose, and was held on the ground by a stake or another sapling. When the rabbit hit the noose, it tightened and the movement caused the twig to come loose and the sapling to snap up. The rabbit was then pulled into the air and ended up hanging from the sapling. Black Nail learned exactly how the trap worked when he stepped on it and the noose snagged his foot. He was almost instantly sent sprawling as the trap yanked his feet out from under him. Luckily, he was too heavy to be pulled into the air, so he just ended up falling on his ass. At least now he knew it worked. The hardest part of snaring rabbits was finding a rabbit trail or hole to place the snare on. Cedar had to look for signs such as droppings, but Black Nail could simply smell rabbit trails and follow them. Rabbits can't hide from me. Me too, great. Black Nail bragged smugly as he set up a trap. Good job, you've got the hang of this. Now you can empty and set the traps yourself each morning, Cedar replied as he watched the goblin work. Wow, he'd just been given a job all of his own. The goblin couldn't believe his master trusted him to go out into the forest alone. It danger. Me die, Black Nail replied in wide-eyed shock. There was no way he could go out into the forest by himself. He was just a tiny little goblin. There were harpies, wolves, spiders, and other more dangerous things out there. Black Nail was fairly sure the forest existed solely to give all the things that ate goblins a place to live. You know enough to keep yourself out of trouble, goblin, Cedar replied sternly with a hardened look in his eyes that showed he wasn't asking, he was commanding. Seeing that look, Black Nail cringed, but he didn't move from where he was standing. Cedar took a step towards the goblin and raised a hand as if to strike him. Black Nail eyes went wide in alarm. Yet after only a few steps, Cedar stopped and scowled at the goblin. Herat isn't going to believe you are useful enough to keep around if you can't even walk into the woods by yourself, Cedar grimly explained to Black Nail. The goblin groaned. Ugh, he had been trying to forget about the dark-eyed glowering chieftain. He didn't really have a choice, so he gave his master a reluctant nod of acceptance. This appeased Cedar somewhat, and he began preparing Black Nail for his first solo excursion. First, Cedar taught Black Nail how to use his knife against various other animals. The goblin was told to stab them in the eye or under their ribs into their heart or lungs. He was also told to watch out for teeth and claws. Black Nail didn't really need to be told that last part, he had already figured that out. Cedar then taught him how to throw a rock faster and more accurately using a strip of cloth called a sling. This amazing invention deeply impressed the goblin. He'd always wanted to be able to throw rocks harder, it was the answer to almost every problem he'd ever faced. Black Nail was also given a belt and some leather pouches to put things like ammo or food in. Thus armed and equipped, Black Nail was ready to start making trips out into the woods alone. He was very proud of himself. Proud but overcome by terrified panic. Under his master's watchful eye, the goblin walked over to the edge of the woods and hesitantly took the first step through the bushes and into the forest. He then cast a look back over his shoulder to see Cedar walking back to camp. Black Nail gulped and his eyes widened in fear. He was all alone. Any second now a hideous monster was going to show up and eat him. For weeks he had either been right beside his master or surrounded by at least a dozen somewhat friendly humans. Now he was all alone out in the woods, or a few feet from the edge of it anyway. The snap of a twig somewhere off in the distance broke his concentration and caused him to twitch in fear. Something was coming. He yelped and scrambled over to the large exposed roots of a nearby tree. Quickly digging, the goblin widened the gap beneath some of the roots and dove down there to hide. From his vantage point at the entrance of his impromptu burrow, the goblin warily eyed the green foliage and tree trunks around him. Nothing moved or made any more noise. Black Nail waited there in his hiding spot for several minutes, overcome by terror. He wanted to dash back to the safety of the camp. The only thing stopping him was fear of what his master would do if he returned without the rabbits from the snares. Several more minutes passed as the goblin tried to think of some way to escape from his current predicament. If he tried to get the rabbits, he would most likely be torn apart and eaten. If he stayed here under the roots, he would slowly starve to death, and if he returned to camp, his master would punish him. He didn't like any of those options. Black Nail had never directly disobeyed his master and didn't know what Cedar would do if he did. It would probably be very bad, but would it be worse than being eaten by harpies? He could always say the snares had been empty. Cedar might even believe it. Having made up his mind and decided that cowardice and begging for mercy were his best options, the goblin slowly rose out from under the roots. He scanned his surroundings for any threats, but the bushes around him and the branches overhead seemed empty. The clearing was also only a little more than a dozen feet away. Then he heard another crackling sound from somewhere behind him. Black Nail dashed frantically towards the clearing and safety. He didn't want to be eaten. With an imaginary host of monsters chasing him, the goblin burst from the shrubs into the clearing as fast as his little legs would carry him, and almost ran right into Cedar. Much to Black Nail's surprise, his master stood only a few feet away and was calmly watching the goblin. Black Nail froze, or at least he tried. He was moving so fast that he tripped over his own feet and was sent cartwheeling painfully across the ground. His head bounced painfully off a rock, but luckily he didn't get hurt anywhere important. Cedar was still standing there silently as Black Nail tentatively got to his feet. The goblin brushed himself off and threw his master a nervous glance. All thoughts of lying to his master were banished by a wave of shame and fear, plus Cedar had probably been standing there the entire time watching. There was noise. Black Nail whined piteously as he gave his master a pleading look. Cedar frowned at him and shook his head disdainfully. Black Nail cringed again. Why had he used such a stupid excuse? He could have come up with a much better one. Take all the time you want, Black Nail, but you won't be getting any food until you bring back the rabbits, and I wouldn't be going out there after dark if I were you, Cedar told Black Nail calmly but harshly. The goblin shivered at the very thought of being out in the forest at night. Everything was worse at night. Black Nail stood there for a few seconds and gathered his thoughts. Cedar just stood there and observed the goblin. With a sigh of resignation, Black Nail realized he had no choice but to go out and empty the snares, unless several rabbits suddenly decided to run up and let him choke them to death one at a time. That seemed unlikely though. Trying to banish his fear, Black Nail stood tall, turned around, and walked back over to the edge of the trees and out into the forest again. This time he forced himself forward more successfully. When he next heard a noise, he merely threw himself violently to the ground and froze there for a few frantic heartbeats instead of running back. He was making progress. When nothing happened, he rose to his feet and continued on. Every time he heard a noise, he twitched in panic but didn't run. Black Nail crept slowly forward towards the snares by moving slowly from hiding spot to hiding spot. He concealed himself up against tree trunks, under fallen logs, in thick bushes, and behind tall grass. Eventually, he made his way to the snares and got the rabbits. Then, after looking around to make sure nothing dangerous was about to eat him, he threw caution to the wind and dashed back to Cedar as fast as he could. When he returned, the sun had moved a fair distance in the sky, but Cedar made no comment. He simply took the rabbits from the goblin and set him to work on another chore. However, much to Black Nail's surprise, he was fed an extra large meal that night. He was also forced out into the bush the next morning, and every day after that as well. Obviously, Black Nail's master didn't really understand how rewards were supposed to work. Soon, the goblin got used to being out in the forest alone, even if he really didn't like it. Then one day it occurred to Black Nail only he knew how many rabbits he actually caught every day. The goblin tried to fight the temptation, briefly, but he secretly began to eat the occasional rabbit himself out in the bush. He just couldn't help himself. Cedar never let him eat the rabbits raw, and Black Nail loved them that way. They were so juicy and warm, even if the fur was icky and sometimes got caught in his throat. Why did humans feel the need to burn everything? Anyway, it's not like he was doing anyone any harm. He caught so many rabbits that Cedar was giving them away. Of course, he wasn't always doing chores. Every night Cedar would throw some of the rabbits into a pot of boiling water. Then he added a bunch of plants to create something called stew. The other bandits who were out scouting or doing other work during the day would then come over and they would all feast. The stew was an alright mix of tastes, but Black Nail loved it because it was the only meal he was allowed to eat as much as he wanted. His master usually only gave him small meals, so he was almost always hungry. He had to forage for the rest when he had time, and Cedar kept him constantly busy. The other humans that joined them for supper tended to be the quiet sort, like Black Nail's master. That was probably they were all men who spent a lot of time in the forest where making too much noise was dangerous. None of them talked to him nearly as much as Vorshaw or Geralt, but they weren't hostile either. They mostly ignored him, although one or two would throw him scraps when Cedar wasn't looking, mostly to annoy his master. Nonetheless, it was the first time Black Nail felt he really belonged with a group of humans and not just his master Cedar. After he begun bringing back more rabbits than they could reasonably use, Cedar had him start digging smoking pits. First he dug a hole up to his waist, a little bit more than 2 feet deep. Cedar had wanted him to use a shovel, but he found it faster to just use his hands. He was a great digger. A fire was then lit at the bottom of the pit and allowed to burn down to coals, then it was fed green hardwood to produce smoke. A grill of small crisscrossing branches was placed 3/4 of the way up. Meat was then cut into small thin strips and placed on the grill. Finally, the pit was covered with branches and leaves to keep the smoke in. When the meat became brittle and dry, it was done. Apparently, this made the meat last longer and easier to carry around with you, but Black Nail mostly just liked the meat's smoky taste. It also gave him a chance to set fires. He liked fire. Of course, all these activities required constant use of his knife, so Cedar had to show him how to sharpen it using a whetstone and care for it using oil. It also resulted in a lot of bloody rabbit pelts lying around everywhere, so next Cedar showed him how to tan them. To tan an animal skin, it was scraped to remove the flesh, washed thoroughly in water, and then stretched out to dry for several days. To Black Nail's delight, next he was told to break open the rabbit's skull, boil the brains in a bucket of water, and then smear the resulting gunk onto the hide by hand. It was so much fun. Cedar had to smack him several times to stop him from licking his fingers while he worked, but he still enjoyed himself. The hide was then left overnight where it wouldn't dry out. Next, the pelt was repetitively stretched and softened until dry, which was fun for the first while anyway, but got old fast. Finally, it was placed over a smoky fire for several hours to dry. Cedar gave several of the finished pelts to Black Nail, since he had no real use for them. The Goblin had used them to make pants. Pants were apparently very important, and they certainly made sitting down more comfortable. No more accidentally sitting on pine cones for him. He'd also managed to stitch together a mismatched rabbit skin cape. Cedar had been the one to teach him how. Cedar wasn't happy with Black Nail having only one pair of shorts. He made the Goblin make a second one. The Goblin was supposed to wear one and wash the other. How stupid was that? Stinky clothes just made it harder for animals to smell you. Cedar of course disagreed and made him change into clean, or at least sort of cleanish clothes every few days. Well, I've certainly turned you into a productive little helper, Cedar told Black Nail proudly one afternoon after the Goblin had finished his chores. Black Nail smiled and nodded cheerfully in response to the praise. He was happy to be useful, but he thought maybe he deserved more of the credit for his own work. You'll sure startle everyone, Cedar mused as he smiled wickedly in anticipation. As they waited for the wagons to catch up, Black Nail was kept very busy. He was perhaps a little too useful for his own good. It got to the point where every time Black Nail saw a rabbit in a snare, the first thing that came to mind was how much work preparing it was going to be. So of course, he started eating more of them raw and throwing away the remains. He thought it was the perfect plan, but Cedar wasn't fooled. After a painful whack on his behind, the Goblin's meals were reduced for a few days as punishment. In hindsight, he really should have spent a little more time wiping all the blood from his mouth before making his way back to camp. Honor among Thieves 3. The next 2 weeks went by in a blur of chores but ended in a bang when the wagons and Herad finally arrived. It was a cool overcast day and it had rained lightly on and off that morning. Black Nail was glad he had his cape. He didn't mind being cold or wet, but he hated being cold and wet at the same time. He shivered and snuggled into the thick fur on the inside of his clothes for warmth. Finally. They sure are late, one of the men who had stayed at the camp with Cedar and Black Nail said. Several of the camp's occupants had come out to see the wagons arrive, including Cedar. I'm not surprised they're behind schedule. It's still too early in the year for the road to be completely dry. Getting those wagons along must have been tough. We're lucky it just started raining this morning, another replied. Maybe we will get paid before winter now, the first one joked, which caused a few of the other men to chuckle humorously. After a few minutes, when nothing more exciting than a bunch of wet and dirty men trudging across a muddy road with some rickety wagons appeared, the watchers started wandering off. Cedar however headed over to the wagons and as usual Black Nail followed him. They passed dozens of miserable-looking outlaws in soaked leather and furs as they trudged down the muddy road. A few of them gave Cedar and his Goblin hostile or curious glances, but most of them seemed far too tired to care about what was going on around them. Cedar headed for the back of the train of wagons. There, Herad was supervising the removal of goods from a broken wagon. The wooden wagon lay on an angle at the side of the road. One of the front wheels had popped completely off, leaving a broken wooden axle exposed. Under their leader's watchful eyes, several men were removing goods from the damaged wagon and either tying them to the horse that had been untied from the wagon or carrying them down the road by hand. Herad looked furious and only a few moments away from violence, but then again she almost always did. Cedar stopped several feet from Herad but within her sight and waited patiently. Black Nail hid behind him, trying not to attract Herad's attention. After a few moments Herad turned her scowl their way. She was dressed in her usual dark leather armor, which was decorated with an assortment of blades. Her cloak's hood was pulled up to protect her from the rain and water dripped down it. You'd better have a nice bonfire going and my shelter ready when I get to camp. I didn't send you ahead so you could slack off, she told Cedar as she turned to face him. I do, as well as some hot deer stew, Cedar replied seemingly unconcerned. You'll make someone a wonderful wife someday, Herad remarked bitingly. I fear I'm well past the marriageable age, he answered deadpan. Harad smiled darkly at him in response. She was clearly amused. That's what I like about you, Cedar. You walk the fine line between never arguing with me and not always agreeing with me either, she told him. How's our status? She continued seriously after a brief pause. Camp is set up. We have food, fire, and some lean-to set up for the men. The old farmhouse has been patched up for you, Cedar reported. The roads, she asked. Scouts haven't seen anything on the road ahead. I've had riders down onto the main road to Riverdown and they haven't seen anything unusual either. No sign of any patrols or traps. Not that the patrols ever leave the main roads anyway. I'm more worried about some other band of brigands getting wind of our haul. I haven't seen any sign of that though. The messengers you sent to the city to meet your contacts are away and have probably gotten there by now, he reported. Good, Harad grunted simply in response. We haven't even lost anyone in the forest yet. Bad luck that, Cedar added after a second of thought. Harad gave him a skeptical look. It's bad luck that we haven't lost anyone to the woods, she asked him dryly. The forest always gets someone eventually. That it hasn't yet only means it could still be me this time, he replied. Bushman superstition, she huffed in annoyance. If you're that worried about it then you could always throw your little pet goblin there to the wolves. The goblin shied away from her. He wasn't sure how serious to take any of her comments. She didn't seem to like him much. He's still pretty scrawny. They'd probably just come back for seconds, Cedar told her with a brief glance at the goblin and the barest hint of humor in his voice. Well, since you've lasted this long without being eaten by something I think you'll be fine for a while yet, Cedar. That said, I want you and the other scouts out there making sure nothing dangerous from the deep woods surprises us. If you see signs of something, I want to know right away. Also, the more food you can scrounge up the less we have to buy, she told him before pausing for a second to think. We're going to be here a while as we wait for the buyers from Riverdown to get here, and take this stuff off our hands. I don't want any nasty surprises while we wait, she finished. You know that neither I nor anyone else can make any promises when it comes to the forest, Harad, but I will do my job, he told her gravely. How professional, your best had just better be good enough. I'll talk with you later when I get things in order here. Find something useful to do with yourself in the meantime, she replied dismissively. Cedar nodded and she turned away. Then Black Nail and his master headed back down the road to camp. The goblin threw one last nervous look backwards at Harad. Cedar noticed his nervous demeanor. You don't need to be so scared of her, Black Nail, he told the goblin. She's mean and scary, master, he whimpered in response. Dangerous too, or she wouldn't still be the boss. There isn't any such thing as a nice bandit, but Harad has her own twisted sense of fairness and she sticks to it. Which is more than most the scum out here have, Cedar explained as they walked down the muddy forest road. Black Nail nodded when his master stopped talking. Not in agreement though, but because he should always be seen to agree with his master. He was still going to avoid Harad as much as possible. She looked at him like he was a bug and she was still deciding whether or not to squish him. As they approached the encampment, someone called out to them. Well, if it isn't Old Man Cedar and his ever-faithful companion, Black Nail the Goblin. I haven't had the pleasure of your company in a while. I guess it's because you've been here living it up, sleeping in one place, resting all day, and eating all the good food while I've been out on the road walking endlessly and staring at the back of a bloody wagon, Geralt yelled with decidedly fake cheer. The skinny man was seated on the ground underneath a canvas that had been set up to block the rain and was massaging one of his feet with both hands. He had unstrapped and taken off his socks and boots and they were sitting on the ground beside him. Yes, that's exactly how we spent our time, Cedar responded sarcastically. Ah, Cedar, never lose that sunny disposition and glib tongue of yours. The world would be a darker place without it, and then I would have no one to engage in philosophical discourse with. Geralt had responded back with his own sarcasm. A second later he winced as he touched a sore spot on his foot. What are you doing here? Cedar asked him pointedly. Well, if you mean why am I here on this lovely earth and for what purpose do I exist, then I guess we will be having that philosophical debate after all, Geralt had responded as he smiled. However, if you are asking how it is I found myself wanted by the crown and squatting in a mud pit among such illustrious company, then I shall have to respond that it is because I killed the right person. Why are you bothering me? Cedar clarified as Geralt had shrugged. A man must amuse himself somehow if he is to stay sane and, just between us, I have to admit that somehow against all odds you're actually one of the more pleasant people to be around in our little pack of villains, he answered with a theatrical sigh. Go bug Vorshaw, Cedar suggested. Alas, the lady is busy with a task from our inexorable commander, Geralt began, but Cedar cut him off with a loud snort. Ah, yes, well, since we're being so discerning here, I must admit that while she is a wonderful woman, Vorshaw is alas not very ladylike. I have certainly never seen a lady eat a meat pie quite like Vorshaw does, Geralt admitted with wide eyes and a fake shudder. Black Nail thought he saw the faint traces of a smile appear on Cedar's lips as Geralt spoke. The younger man then turned to the goblin and gave him an appraising look. Hello, Black Nail. I must apologize for ignoring you while Cedar and I engaged in our usual long-winded banter. You seem taller. Oh, and I must compliment you on your new clothes. Your own work, I presume? Geralt asked. Yes, I made, Black Nail answered proudly as he looked down at his rabbit-skin pants and cape. Their ragged patchwork surfaces were soaked by the rain. So I had guessed. They are certainly unique-looking, Geralt had remarked. Before he could say any more, Cedar cut him off again. If you're done insulting Black Nail's clothes, I'll be leaving. Also, I notice you are not wearing those fancy clothes you first showed up in. Perhaps, unlike the goblin, you are incapable of making or even repairing your own clothes, he huffed. Geralt had been insulting his clothes? Black Nail felt his pride wilt. He thought his cape was nice and cozy. Geralt saw the goblin's face fall. Tisk, your master is being dramatic, Black Nail. I was just having fun. I like your clothes. They're very practical, he added. Geralt then got up and patted Black Nail on the head. Cedar scowled at them and rolled his eyes. Come on, Black Nail. We have work to do, Cedar commanded. He then stomped off to his campsite. Black Nail turned to follow, but Geralt had called out to him. Come see me at supper time tonight, Black Nail, and I'll have a treat for you, Geralt had told him with a friendly goodbye wave. The man then sat back down and started massaging his now dirty feet again. After Black Nail caught up to his master, they grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods. The result was a rather unproductive slog through the rain-drenched forest. The only animals they ran into were spine toads, and you couldn't eat those. The large green frogs came out in the rain and camouflaged in with the grass and leafy plants that littered the ground. Their backs were covered in poisonous spines, so the goblin and his master had to watch where they stepped. Eventually, Cedar was forced to admit defeat and returned to the encampment empty-handed and very wet. It had stopped raining, but everything was still covered in water and muddy. If he had been miserable before, then Cedar was truly and deeply unhappy now. Black Nail heard him muttering to himself as they headed over to their campfire to dry. After a few minutes of work, they got the campfire going and its crackling flames started to warm them up. Cedar hung his clothes up to dry and Black Nail cheerfully added his cape to the drying rack as well. The old scout then turned to the goblin. I'm going to take a break. You can practice something or other, he muttered to Black Nail irritably. The old scout then ducked into his tent and closed the flap. Black Nail heard him lay down and his breathing deepened as he fell asleep. As his master had instructed, Black Nail started practicing. The first thing he practiced was how to curl up next to the fire and take a nap. You could never be good enough at that. Black Nail awoke with a tired yawn. As he sleepily opened his eye, he noticed it was quite a bit darker out. The sun had begun to set and the shadows had lengthened. Most the campfires around him had been lit and they had people sitting around them. Cedar's fire was running low, so the goblin threw some more wood on it. He liked watching things burn, it was pretty. As he was working, a cool breeze blew through the trees and into the camp. The hungry flames flared up and Black Nail jumped nervously backwards for a moment. The scent of various cooking foods also reached Black Nail's nose. Most the bandits seemed to be settling down to eat. Black Nail's own stomach grumbled. He hadn't eaten supper yet. He threw a glance at Cedar's tent and listened. He heard the deep breathing of sleep from within the tent and sighed. He wouldn't be getting any food from there. Then with a flash of excitement the goblin remembered Geralt's promise. It was supper time. If he found Geralt, then the man would have a treat for him. Where was he, though? Black Nail wandered around until he found himself at the southern edge of the camp. Several men were seated at a campfire off to his right, one of whom was glaring at him angrily. Black Nail ignored him and looked around for Geralt or Vorsha. They would probably be together. The skinny man was obviously the woman's subordinate. After a quick scan, he saw Geralt up ahead at another campfire. Black Nail smiled in glee and sprang excitedly towards him. It was time for a snack. He hoped it would be a tasty one. Suddenly, he heard a loud twang followed by the sound of something impacting the ground behind him hard. The startled goblin yelped in surprise and jumped off to the side, landing on all fours. His heart was beating loudly in his chest and there was an arrow quivering in the ground right beside where he had just been standing. What was this? Black Nail nervously looked up to see that the glaring man was now standing up and had an empty bow in his hands. The man's thick face was contorted by an expression of anger and sadistic glee. He was a large human with broad shoulder, short greasy black hair, and a grin that revealed a few missing teeth. His chin was covered in dark stubble and as he looked at the goblin he burst out laughing. Look at that ugly critter jump. You go back to your senile keeper now and don't wander around stinking up the place, or next time I'm gonna put an arrow through your eye, the man viciously told the goblin. The other two men at the campfire grinned and started laughing as well. Black Nail felt a wave of panic and got ready to flee at the first opportunity. He hissed in alarm and started to back away. Apparently, this offended the big man because he scowled and took a step towards the goblin. As he moved he drew a large knife and an angry grimace appeared on his face. I'm gonna cut your little green ears off and make myself a necklace, the man said with eyes narrowed in anger as he advanced upon the small figure of the goblin. There was no way Black Nail could fight such a huge human, so he was going to have to run away. The trick would be to make it back to Cedar's camp alive. What in all the hells are you doing? An angry voice interjected all of a sudden. Everyone glanced over towards the voice and saw Geralt approaching with a furious-looking scowl on his face. Seeing him approach, the other two men got up and stood behind their big friend. Clearly, they were his lackeys. None of your damn business, pansy, the big man growled back at Geralt. I think it is, Dafer, Geralt responded. See, I was the one that invited that goblin over and here you are getting in his way. I have a problem with that. Not to mention Cedar is going to be furious when he hears about your latest bit of stupidity here. The big man named Dafer narrowed his eyes. He looked to be almost twice Geralt's size. I ain't afraid of that old fool Cedar and I ain't afraid of your bitch Vorsha. She's not here to protect you anyways, pansy. So you scuttle along because for damn sure I ain't afraid of a skinny wimp like you, Dafer bragged. I can take care of myself, Geralt responded heatedly as his hand moved to the dagger at his hip. Dafer must have sensed fear though, because he smiled down at the smaller man and stalked towards him. However, Geralt held his ground and drew his dagger. Dafer suddenly lunged, moving faster than his large size suggested. His dagger arced around and slashed at Geralt's face. The smaller man's eyes widened in surprise, but he managed to tuck his chin in and dodge below the attack. However, the dagger grazed his shoulder and bit deep enough to draw blood. Instead of retreating though, Geralt leaned under Dafer's extended arm and stabbed towards his chest. Dafer twisted out of the way but received a shallow cut of his own. However, Geralt's attack left him overextended. He stumbled and Dafer's big meaty fist swung around and impacted his face. With a loud smacking sound, Geralt was sent spinning onto the ground. He quickly tried to stand up but couldn't quite manage it. The blow had left him stunned. All he could do was hold his nose as blood leaked from it and groan as Dafer moved closer. The larger man towered over him with a cruel smile on his lips. He held the cut on his chest with one hand and his dagger in the other. "I'm going to kill you now, you damned pansy," Dafer growled. Black Nail froze in panic. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to save Geralt, but he couldn't think of anything. Fighting wouldn't work. A goblin would be killed if he hurt a human, and death was even worse than losing a good source of treats. Besides, how could a little goblin like him fight such a giant man? Suddenly, a new voice spoke up. "How about me, Dafer, are you afraid of me?" Harad asked as she detached herself from the shadows and strode over. Dafer's lackeys jumped in surprise, but the man himself just scowled. He threw Geralt an angry look and fingered the knife in his hand before turning back to Harad. "This goblin attacked me, and when I tried to catch it, Geralt here tried to stab me while I was distracted. I was just defending myself." "These two saw it," he told her as he indicated his lackeys. Harad simply tilted her head slightly to show her skepticism. Her eyes grew colder and her smile tighter as she looked the big man over. "I have only a few simple rules, as you should all know well. First, you do as I say. Second, you don't lie to me. The third and last is you don't fight or run without permission. You have now broken 2 of those rules," she explained. Dafer hesitated again, but then a defiant look appeared on his face. He gazed down at Harad as if comparing their sizes. The large man was many times Harad's weight. He raised his knife. "Now look here, B," he started to say. However, his speech stopped as Harad pushed the tip of one of her daggers up through the bottom of his jaw and into his brain. He hadn't even seen the blade coming. He just blinked in pained confusion as she pulled it back out of his skull. Harad had moved almost too quickly for Black Nail to see. Her hand and the dagger seemed to just instantly move from one point to another without going through the space between. Dafer's eyes rolled up into his head and he made several brief choking noises as he collapsed into a pile of rapidly spreading blood on the ground. Harad calmly wiped her blade clean with a rag and resheathed it. "So very stupid," she said to no one in particular as she turned to the lackeys. "Dispose of the body, now," she told them. With terrified expressions they nodded and jumped to obey. After throwing Dafer's corpse one last disgusted look, Harad started walking alone towards the center of the camp. The dark aura she exuded discouraged anyone from following her, not that anyone wanted to. Geralt got unsteadily to his feet while still holding his bloody noise. He looked worse for wear. His clothes were dirty and ruffled. "I think I could have won that fight myself, but a gentleman never turns down timely aid," he asserted proudly while staring off into the direction Harad had gone. Black Nail gave him a dubious look. He had a very different opinion on the man's chances of victory. The small man had been seconds away from death. "I really need another drink. You still want that treat?" Geralt asked the goblin as he wiped some of the blood from his face. Honor among thieves 4. After an uneventful night, Black Nail was woken up early the next morning and sent out to check the rabbit snares. He had done it plenty of times now and was no longer afraid of going out into the woods alone. His fear had been replaced by familiarity, at least as long as he was only making the short trip to the snares and back. Black Nail yawned as he wandered through the bushes at the edge of the forest. His memories of his old life in the sewers had begun to fade. As dangerous as it was here, the camp had become his new home. It wasn't like there was any possible way to get back there anyway. The sewers were many days away through the forest, and that wasn't a journey he ever planned on making. His new life did have perks. For one thing, the forest smelled much better than the sewers. He missed being around other goblins sometimes, especially the females, but in the sewers he'd mostly just fought the other goblins anyway. They'd fought over hierarchy, food, shiny things, mates, and of course just because they'd been bored. Besides, even though humans were so big and scary, they sometimes gave him treats and praised him. No goblin had ever given Black Nail tasty things, unless he'd beaten them up first. The morning sun was shining sedately through the loose roof of leaves above him. It was a warm, clear day without a single cloud visible in the sky. The morning birds sang joyfully in the trees, either ignoring or ignorant of the goblin strolling along beneath them. Black Nail stopped for a second to listen to the birdsong and scan the grass and tall plants around him. As he stood motionless, his green skin and hide clothes blended into the surrounding, camouflaging him. After listening attentively for a while, Black Nail heard and saw nothing unusual, so he continued his stroll. There didn't seem to be anything dangerous around. He moved casually but kept an eye and ear open for anything out of place. If there was one lesson Cedar made sure he never forgot, it was that no one was ever truly safe out in the forest. He would hate to let his master down by dying some horrific death. The wary little goblin soon reached the snares, but just as he was about to get to work he heard an unexpected noise. What was that? Black Nail twitched in surprise and spun around. Was it a terrible monster about to leap out and eat him? It probably wasn't. The grass under one of the triggered snares was just rustling. The goblin didn't think anything really dangerous could hide in so small a patch of grass. It was probably a bird or something. Black Nail narrowed his eyes and quietly drew his sling anyway. Something might be trying to steal his rabbit. He couldn't see what was making the noise from his position, so he circled around a tree to get a better angle. As Black Nail watched, something started to try and climb the sapling a rabbit hung from. The goblin's eyes widened as he looked on in surprise. He had no idea what the freakish thing was. How could it even move? It was just a blob of liquidy stuff. It was like a pseudo pile of snot with a bunch of weird shapes floating in it. Yet, it was moving and actually managing to slowly work its way up the sapling. It looked really wrong, like water flowing uphill but uglier. Black Nail hit it with a stone from his sling just on general principles. The blob of slime quivered and froze for a second before falling to the ground with a weird muted splashing noise. Had he killed it? He hoped so. Well, apparently he hadn't, because as the goblin watched, it reformed itself into a round blob and started oozing towards him with surprising speed. Uh-oh, it was headed his way. How could such a weird thing move? He hit it with another stone in the hopes that would stop it. The slime quivered on impact and the stone sank into the blob, but a second later it popped out again with wet slurping noise and fell to the ground. It also kept closing the distance between them, so Black Nail swiftly took a nervous step back. He didn't know how dangerous the freaky booger ball was. He was pretty sure Cedar had never mentioned anything like it to him, or at least not when he'd been paying attention. Black Nail circled around his mysterious opponent warily. Every once in a while it would put on a burst of speed and ooze towards him over the forest floor, but the goblin deftly dodged it every time. Ha, he was faster than the stupid thing. Now, he just had to find a way to hurt it before it found a way to hurt him. Suddenly, the blob burst towards him again and he moved to dodge. Or at least he tried. As he went to jump away, something tugged on his neck sharply and choked him. His inconvenient momentum caused his feet to fly out from under him and he landed hard on his tailbone. Ow, his poor ass. He then watched in wide-eyed horror as the large blob of slime descended on him. With a wet smack it crossed the ground and enveloped his arm. Eek, off, Black Nail yelled as he flailed and tried to get free, but the transparent blob was stuck fast. The terrified goblin tried to climb to his feet, but the slime had a grip on his arm and wouldn't let go, no matter how hard he pulled. He yelped in fear as the thing began to climb up his arm towards his head. This was not good. Desperately, Black Nail tried to claw at it with his free hand, but it just reformed around the cuts. No, that wasn't fair. He began kicking at it with his feet but stopped when one foot sunk into the thing and became stuck as well. Not his best plan ever. At least it seemed to confuse the thing because it stopped climbing his arm, for the moment anyway. Black Nail whimpered and frantically tried to think. He wasn't just any stupid goblin. He was Black Nail. What would Cedar or another human do? Come on, think. A human would use a tool. Black Nail felt a flash of hope. That's right, he had a tool. The goblin reached with his free hand and drew the knife Cedar had given him. Desperately, he stabbed the slime several times, but it still didn't do any permanent damage. The ooze just flowed back after he cut it. What next? He looked his opponent over as the slime began sucking him in again, this time by both his caught limbs. With a chill, Black Nail realized he was going to die unless he thought of something. Think. Maybe he should attack the weird things floating in the slime. Frantically, he tried to stab the ones closest to him, but they were too deep and the knife couldn't reach them. To his horror, he felt the wet edge of the slime begun to climb his neck. He shivered with dread as he squirmed, trapped upon the ground by the slime's weight and sticky hold. He had a sudden idea, but it was desperate and stupid. He didn't want to do it, but he was running out of time. He was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to breathe whatever this thing was made of. The very thought of the slime encasing his head and flowing down his nose and mouth was horrible. Taking a deep breath, Black Nail steeled his resolve and pulled back his arm back. He then stabbed the thing as hard as he could. His arm sank deep into the slime and was caught. He wouldn't be able to get it out or attack the slime again, and now he only had a single foot left, which didn't do him a lot of good. However, much to his relief, he saw that the blade of the knife in his hand had managed to reach its target. The blackish sack-like thing floating in the slime was impaled on the knife and dark fluid begun to spill out and mix with the transparent slime. Black Nail watched wide-eyed and desperately hoped that he had actually done something and that he wouldn't soon be eaten alive. The blob rippled with small waves, then convulsed crazily. To his horror, Black Nail was sucked further in and his face was enveloped. Then just as suddenly the goblin was spat out in a splash of slime. He gasped for breath and sucked down air joyously. He was free, and not dead. As the black liquid spread throughout the rest of the blob, it started to dissolve. Black Nail lay on the ground covered in icky, weird-smelling ooze and watched as the creature expired with a loud gurgling noise. Eventually, only a smelly stain and several weird twisted organs remained. Black Nail picked himself off the ground and tried to wipe the slime off his skin and clothes. He grinned in excitement. Wow, was he ever glad to be alive? That had been extremely close. After the goblin gave up cleaning himself off, he turned to look at the remains of the creature. It was mostly just smelly gunk, which he had more than enough of, but he spotted something shiny in among the remains. It was a small crystal. Black Nail stashed the crystal in one of his pouches and headed back to camp. A few minutes later he remembered he was supposed to be checking the snares and swiftly turned around again. He collected the rabbit carcasses and hurried back to Cedar. He was already very late. His master would be wondering where he'd gone. He scurried down the path as fast as he could and still maintain a bit of stealth and awareness. He made it close to the camp without any more trouble. Although he startled one of the bandit scouts as he ran past him on the trail. The man gave him a very surprised look as he passed. Black Nail ignored him and hurried home. He exited the forest and immediately headed through the camp towards Cedar's tent. He really wanted to brag about his victory. Several people gave him odd glances as he passed because he was still covered in quite a bit of slime. It dribbled down his as he ran. They didn't stop him however, and he soon arrived at the tent. Luckily for him, Cedar was seated out front on a stump oiling some of his tools. As Black Nail ran over and threw the rabbit carcasses unceremoniously on the ground, Cedar looked up. He examined the goblin with an exasperated expression. "In the name of all that is holy, what have you been up to now?" he asked with troubled tone. Black Nail was excited to show off, so he reached down and pulled the orb from the pouch at his belt and shoved it into Cedar's face. "I take from Bad Puddle," he exclaimed with pride. Cedar leaned back away from the orb that had been shoved in his face and eyed it carefully. A very confused look came over his features. "A Bad Puddle," he repeated without understanding. The old scout gave Black Nail a questioning look and took the crystal from him. He rotated in his hands as he examined it. "Slimy, smelly thing," Black Nail explained excitedly. He wanted his master to realize how great a hunter and fighter he was. "Slimy? A slime? You fought a slime, and this is its crystal," Cedar said with surprise as his brow tightened with concern. "Where exactly did you fight the slime?" he asked in a serious tone. Black Nail was more than happy to answer. "At rabbit traps. Tried to steal but I stop. It grabbed but I stab good," Black Nail answered as his back straightened with pride. While the goblin talked, his master started to look vaguely impressed. This caused Black Nail to grow even happier with himself. Truly, he was great and mighty goblin. "You beat a slime yourself, eh? Must have been a small dud, but good work," Cedar replied as he stood up. "Not small, huge. Bigger than me," Black Nail exaggerated as he extended his arms to show how big it had been. He still wanted more praise, but Cedar just gave him an amused but doubtful look before examining the crystal again. "What's that?" Black Nail asked his master. "It's the slime's crystal. They all have one. Slimes only grow in crystal caves. Let's hope there isn't one nearby. They're very dangerous, the only place more dangerous than the forest in the Iron Teeth," he explained. "Badder than spiders?" Black Nail asked doubtfully. "Yes," Cedar replied with a grumble of irritation. "I'm going to have to inform Herad." With a command to Black Nail to follow, Cedar marched off towards the old farmhouse that Herad had taken over as her command post. Black Nail usually avoided it because Herad was a scary lady. The thatch on the roof had been replaced and the door had been reattached. The repairs were crude looking but serviceable. Of course, the crudest thing about it was the pair of thugs standing guard out front. They were two big ugly human brutes who really seemed to be not so much standing guard as hanging out there with bored expressions on their face because they had nowhere better to be. As Cedar approached, he addressed one of them. "Is Herad in?" he asked gruffly. "Yay, she's in there," the guard answered him casually. Neither guard bothered to block them as they approached. "I'd like to talk to her," Cedar told them. The two guards looked at each other and with a sigh the further one turned to the door of the house and knocked. "Boss, Cedar's here to see you," he announced to the closed door. After a minute he stepped out of the way and the door opened to reveal Herad glaring down at them. She wore her usual leather, but her cloak and most her knives were missing. Candle light flickered behind her, illuminating the interior of the dark house. At his master's side, Black Nail instinctively slouched down to make himself less noticeable. "Normally I'd ask if this was important, but since it's you, Cedar, I know you wouldn't show your face without a good reason," she commented irritably as she stepped out to talk with him. Cedar watched her as she descended the short steps in front of the door. She met his eyes and gave him an amused smile. "My goblin Black Nail was out checking the snares this morning," he told her with a gesture in the goblin's direction. "Fascinating, but as much as I love hearing a man brag about his pet, please get to the point," she replied with a roll of her eyes. "When he came back he was covered in slime and had a crystal core. He told me he fought a small slime that was trying to get at the snares." "I thought you would want to know," Cedar told her. Black Nail huffed in displeasure. It had been a giant monster slime, not a small one. Cedar hadn't even seen it. Herad frowned and scowled in annoyance when Cedar had finished speaking. However, Cedar was clearly not the target of her displeasure. "You think it's a sign there might be a crystal cave around?" she asked him. "Yes, there has to be one around somewhere. The question is how close. The slime could have wandered a fair distance. It probably did, since we haven't already seen more crystal beasts or mutants," Cedar told her. "So then you don't think we have a problem?" she inquired. Cedar shook his head in response and brandished the crystal core he had gotten from Black Nail. "We could just have gotten lucky. The cave could also be mostly sealed, so only things like slimes can slip through. Larger slimes can be very dangerous though. Some even have active cores and magical abilities like mutants. Those can rival drakes in strength," he explained as Herad gave him a frustrated look. "This is obviously your area of expertise, Cedar. Why don't you just explain what you want done so I can approve it?" she asked him with an annoyed tone. "It's too dangerous to ignore. Tomorrow I'd like to send all the scouts to search the perimeter. Then I'd like for as many men as possible to go after them once it's safer and do a more thorough search. A small crevice will be hard to find but easy enough to seal," he told her. "Well, at least you don't want to abandon the camp," Herad mused aloud as she took a second to think his request over. "Very well, it's not like most the men are doing anything more than lazing around. This will just help keep them out of trouble. I'll inform them tonight," she added, and Cedar nodded in acceptance. "Then I'll take my leave," the old scout told her. Herad just eyed him as she leisurely drew a dagger and lightly pressed her finger against the tip as if testing the sharpness. She continued stroking it for a few seconds before replying. "What if it's more than a crevice? New types of monocrystals are worth a fortune to the mage guilds," enough to set someone up for life, she commented dryly. Dangerous, you could stir up a monster capable of killing half the band. Maybe even something on the level of the city killer, and then Riverdown would join Coriolis in ruin, he answered with concern. Harad gave him a doubtful look. To the first, I can always get more men, and as for the second, it's not only horribly unlikely but also simply not my problem, she answered him. It is if the beast kills us all first, which is pretty damn likely. You also need somewhere to trade your stolen goods, he replied. We can move, Harad said as she shrugged in response. Besides, you're the one who is constantly reminding everyone that no one is ever safe out here. A mutant could attack us at any time and it wouldn't be a surprise to either of us. This is the Iron Teeth and we're bloody bandits. Every day we survive is a lucky one. A large payoff is worth a large risk. As you wish, Cedar replied with a sigh. I guess we'll see what we find tomorrow. Indeed we will, and if we find the cave I will be one making the call. You can go now, she told him dismissively in a cold commanding tone. Cedar simply nodded and quickly withdrew. Black Nail followed his master and thought over what he had just heard. It sounded like tomorrow would be exciting. Honor among Thieves 5. Harad had done as she said and organized the search that evening. By early the next morning practically everyone in the band was up and about looking for the cave where the slime had come from. Only a few of the bandits were left to guard the camp and watch the roads. The entire operation was well planned and organized by both Cedar and Harad. The scouts went out first to make sure the area was safe. They knew the forest and its many dangers so they could locate them before the less skilled bandits stumbled into them unaware. They were also much less likely to get lost among the green maze of trees. The rest of the men then followed behind the scouts and made up for their lack of skill with numbers. They worked together to thoroughly search the bush for caves. They had been carefully instructed to move in small groups and not wander around alone. They had also been warned to look out for danger signs because it was more than likely that the scouts would miss something. It was a deep forest, and Harad's rangers were skilled but still far from perfect. After a few hours of searching, the scouts were ordered to start doubling back to make sure the less skilled woodsmen hadn't got themselves stuck in mud or fallen down a hole. Cedar still thought there would be a few casualties. It was just to be expected with so many untrained men blindly wandering the woods. Thus, it would also be the scouts' job to collect the lost and the bodies. Cedar himself served as a scout and Black Nail went with his master. This was no trip to empty the snares, they would be ranging far outside the somewhat safe areas they normally frequented. The old ranger had been assigned the area north of where Black Nail had fought the slime. It was not a direction Black Nail, or many other people, had traveled. As they walked north the terrain became rough. Hills and ravines sprung up out of nowhere to block their view. Black Nail found the constant changes in elevation exhausting. Now he knew why humans stuck so close to their roads all the time. Having to scramble up muddy hills and rocky inclines was a lot of work for a goblin with stubby little legs. Don't worry about being too quiet, Cedar told Black Nail as they started their search. Since we're not hunting game today, I'm more worried about running into a bear or something than attracting predators. Yes, master, the goblin replied automatically. He knew what his master meant. Certain dangerous animals were likely to attack you if you surprised them but would normally avoid people if they heard them coming. Thus, moving stealthy wasn't always the best idea. The forest canopy that Black Nail was walking below blocked out most of the sun, but it wasn't nearly as dark here as in the spider-infested woods. Black Nail was very glad that they weren't headed in that direction. He shuddered at just the memory of the creepy webs that blanketed those shadowy woods and their nasty residents. The trees here were tall and thick. The ground was covered by short leafy plants where it wasn't blanketed in dead leaves. Here and there, small white and blue flowers peeked out from behind other plants. Black Nail actually found it all very calm and nice looking. The goblin had tried to eat a few of the flowers earlier but Cedar had pulled them out of his hand before he could taste them. Apparently, they were poisonous. Oh well, they had smelled a little off anyway. As Black Nail followed his master he sniffed and examined the ground for signs of the slime's trail. He hadn't found anything yet though. He darted around to check under bushes and around rocks for crevices or hollows. He wanted to be the one to find the cave and its treasures. He was sure that would earn him a reward. Plus, he wanted to see the cave slimes came from. It sounded very interesting. He was a very brave and loyal goblin when Cedar was standing right behind him. As they followed the ravine, a low area appeared in front of them and they walked cautiously down into it. Soon, the ground began to get muddy and they had to watch where they stepped. Black Nail's short legs meant he had to hop from dry spot to keep up with Cedar, who could simply step over the wet muddy areas. The goblin almost fell into the mud several times but managed to catch himself after some skillful wild flailing. After a bit more walking, the pair stepped through a gap in the foliage and into a wide open area. There was a large break in the canopy above that let in light. The leafy shrubs on the ground grew thick under the open sky. The few trees Black Nail saw were thin and seemed quite young. The drone of insects and cries of birds were louder here as well. Cedar stepped forward into the sun, but stopped to survey the clearing before going any further in. Black Nail stepped up behind his master and looked around as well. The goblin couldn't see much, though. He was too short to see over a lot of the plants and bushes. He tried hopping as high as he could but that didn't really help. He did however manage to spot several patches of tasty dewberries. Black Nail licked his lips. Dewberries were so tasty. He was very tempted to go grab some but he knew his master would smack him if he ran ahead like that, also something might kill him. Something feels off, the old grey-haired scout muttered to himself as he looked around. He apparently didn't see anything though, because he tentatively started walking forward again into the clearing. Cedar trampled the long grass and shoved bushes aside as he moved inwards. Cedar's careful stride carried him towards a group of small trees that were surrounded by a large berry patch. He stared at it for a few seconds before turning and glowering at the rest of the clearing suspiciously. The scout took another step forward. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound assaulted Black Nail's ears. The goblin whipped around in time to see a large branch break loose from a tree and slam into Cedar. Cedar raised his arms in an attempt to shield himself. The branch knocked them aside as it smacked into him with a loud thud. Blood spattered across the ground as Cedar was battered. Black Nail gasped in shock, but was relieved to see that his master had managed to stay on his feet. He was just tangled up in the fallen tree limb. The goblin rushed forward to help his master disentangle himself. He really hoped his wonderful master wasn't injured. He wouldn't be able to get back to camp without him. As he ran, Black Nail was abruptly struck by a strong sense of wrongness. Something wasn't right here, something was bad. The goblin scrutinized the scene in front of himself carefully. The branch was wrong, he realized. It hadn't come loose from the tree at all, it was still attached to it. In fact, it had stopped falling and had even risen a bit as Cedar began to struggle to free himself from its clutches. Much to the goblin's confusion, Cedar seemed to be having a lot of trouble untangling himself. His eyes were also wide and showed a hint of fear. That was wrong, his master shouldn't be afraid of a tree branch. Black Nail had a sudden unwelcome thought. Was this a trap? Had someone or something made the branch break on purpose? Black Nail had no clue what was going on, but he knew what he was going to do. He drew his knife. It was time to find something to stab, until it was time to start running away. Cedar began flailing and yelling in earnest as he tried to pull himself free from the tree branch. The old scout also pulled out his own knife and stabbed at the branch with his free hand. Then, the entire tree quivered as Cedar was abruptly yanked towards it by something unseen. Black Nail had used this time to reach his master. Sprinting, he scurried around to get at the branch and then sprang atop it with a quick leap. The goblin had thought he would find some rope or something to cut, but he didn't see anything like that. So, as soon as he landed, he stabbed the branch wildly with his knife. The blade hit the bark and skidded across it without penetrating. What? That wasn't right. This was very weird wood. Cedar was also hacking at the branch with his knife. However, his longer blade didn't seem to penetrate the wood any better than Black Nail's did. In fact, the wood seemed very strange in general to Black Nail. It was warm and weirdly segmented. Looking at where his master was stuck to the branch, it almost seemed like it had grabbed him, as if it had claws. Trees didn't have claws. Black Nail was pretty sure Cedar would have mentioned it if they did. Behind you, Black Nail. Down. Cedar yelled at the goblin suddenly. Instantly, Black Nail obeyed and rolled off the branch. He was just in time. With a loud whooshing sound like leaves in the wind, another branch swept through the space he had been occupying a moment ago. The tree quivered again and then tilted wildly towards them, knocking leaves free and sending them spiraling down to earth in a green storm. Black Nail yelped in surprise as the tree-like creature rose up and twisted around to rearrange itself into a horrible new shape. Uh-oh, it was time to run. As the alarmed goblin watched, the tough-looking tree trunk cracked and split to become two long segmented legs. Branches then shifted to become a pair of armored arms. The top of the tree also divided itself to reveal two more long twisted arms and a monstrous insect-like head that was crowned by two short stalks that ended in small black eyes. The twisted thing's vicious mandible-adorned maw opened as it screeched hungrily down at them. Black Nail winced as the disturbingly high sound drilled painfully into his ears. As the terrible armored monstrosity rose, it pulled the struggling Cedar under itself and pinned him there against the ground with one long arm. The strange creature was taller than a man even though it was hunched over and balancing on four long legs. One free claw had Cedar firmly in its grasp and the other was swinging around again to grab at Black Nail. It most resembled a giant predatory stick insect or some sort of horribly stretched out leafy crab. What the goblin had taken to be bark was actually camouflaged carapace with lichen and moss growing on it. The weirdest part, however, was the smaller branches and leaves. They poked out randomly up from its back and limbs, and as far as Black Nail could tell they seemed to be real plants that had sprouted from the creature's carapace. The terrified goblin rolled out of the way again as one of the creature's limbs descended down at him. The claw missed him, hitting the ground instead and scarring the forest floor. Eep, run away. We've angered the trees. Black Nail shrieked as sprang back to his feet and started running around in little circles through the grass. The goblin didn't know where to go and wailed fearfully. There were trees in every direction. He was doomed. Just then Cedar stabbed the arm holding him again. This time he seemed to have found a weak spot because the creature hissed and shook in pain. The leafy claw that had been going after Black Nail pinned Cedar's other arm instead. Damnation and misery, that wasn't the plan, Cedar screamed in anger and pain as he struggled to escape from beneath the claws that held him firm against the ground. Black Nail knew he needed to come up with a plan of his own very quickly or his master was going to die, leaving him all alone and very far from the camp. There was no way he was heading back by himself now that he knew the trees would try to eat him. He wouldn't last a second. He had to think. He had somehow beaten the slime. With the right plan he could beat this thing too. So again, what tools did he have? Right. Black Nail drew his sling and slipped a stone into it. He twirled it to build momentum and sighted on the target his master had told him to aim for first, the eyes. He flung the stone towards one of the small black targets but the projectile missed and whooshed past the creature. The creature flinched away and hissed in alarm, though. It apparently didn't like having rocks thrown at it, which meant Black Nail should do it again. Black Nail launched another stone, this time it hit the creature on the head just under the eye stalk. The tree thing didn't seem hurt but it flinched again and brought an arm up to protect its fragile-looking eye stalks. However, in order to do that it had to let go of Cedar with one hand. Let go, you bloody overgrown bush bug! Cedar shouted as he wasted no time and immediately started stabbing again with his newly freed hand. Black Nail continued to throw stones at the twisted creature until it turned away from him in an attempt to shield its head from the small projectiles. Ha, his plan was working. He was a genius. Then, with a cry of victory, Cedar rolled free from under his captor. He had managed to stab the knife almost all the way into the limb, holding him by aiming for a joint. The pain had caused the creature to hiss and let go of its prey for a second. However, it quickly recovered and immediately tried to grab Cedar again. Cedar obviously had other ideas. He sprung up onto his feet with a grunt of pain and dashed towards the goblin as Black Nail covered him by slinging more stones at the now advancing monstrosity. The thing skittered towards its escaping prey on all 6 of its legs now. Its body and leaves shaking as it gave chase through the long grass of the clearing. Run, yelled Cedar as he grimaced painfully and dashed past the goblin. Black Nail did. As fast as he could he spun around and scrambled away from the thing trying to eat him. His master sure liked stating the obvious sometimes. They both ran through the woods at full sprint, with fear and pure survival instinct driving them forward. Black Nail had no illusions about what would happen if the creature managed to get a hold of him with its long branch-like claws. Soon, the sound of pursuit and shaking leaves stopped. Black Nail risked a glance backwards and saw the creature turn and begin to wander away back to the clearing it had come from. Thankfully, it hadn't been a very fast runner. Ahead of him, Cedar came to a stop and leaned against a tree. He was clearly in pain and exhausted. Blood leaked through gashes on both his arms where the creature had grabbed him. In their haste to escape, the man and the goblin had run into the deeper part of the bush away from the sunlight. Unbegotten mimics, Cedar growled between 2 heavy breaths as he rested. Black Nail remembered his master mentioning forest mimics once. He had told the goblin that they hid among trees and grabbed prey that wandered too close. He had also said to run from them if he saw one because they were slow. Black Nail was pretty sure his master had missed some important information in there somewhere. He had certainly not been expecting something like the thing that had attacked them. Are we safe now? There are trees everywhere, the goblin sobbed in terror as he spun around in circles. No matter how fast he turned, he couldn't look in every direction at once. We're good. I should have seen it. I knew something was off. That was a perfect mimic hunting ground. They can only mimic smaller trees and they like lots of sun, Cedar groaned regretfully. He then turned to the goblin beside him who was swaying unsteadily on his feet from too much spinning. I'm getting you a bigger and sharper knife, Cedar told him. Yes, please, Black Nail replied with an exuberant nod of agreement. He liked that idea. This was the second time his knife had failed him. Just think of all the things he could stab with a bigger knife. After taking a few minutes to suck down air and recover as much as possible, Cedar pushed himself up off the tree with a wince and turned to the goblin. We need to head back. I'm wounded and the blood will attract predators, he explained. The old scout then hesitated for a second before grumbling and adding, thanks Black Nail. You're a good goblin. Caught by surprise, Black Nail broke out into a huge smile. His master had never complimented him other than the occasional good job before. He felt fierce pride rise in his chest. He had been very brave. Thank you, master. I'm so happy you know dead, he gushed as he strode forward and hugged his master around the waist. This caused Cedar to blanch, look uncomfortable, and then try to squirm away. We need to head back. Let go and help me with my arms, Black Nail, he told the goblin awkwardly. He clearly wanted to push the goblin away but couldn't manage it with his wounds. Black Nail waited a few seconds before letting go. He enjoyed the hug and had to put back the pouch his naughty fingers had instinctively borrowed by mistake when they had first hugged. Yes, master, he acknowledged when he was done and had let go. Cedar crouched down and had Black Nail go through his pouches until he found one that contained some strong herbal-smelling paste and another that contained some clean rags. Cedar then had him take out a rag and apply the paste to his wounds using the cloth. Finally he had the goblin tie one rag tightly around the largest cut to stop the bleeding, and then use another one to tie his arm up to his chest to support it and prevent it from moving. That will do. Let's go, Cedar grunted as Black Nail finished. The goblin stepped away and Cedar rose to his feet. The two of them then began the long walk back to the camp. Cedar was wounded but could still walk without too much difficulty. Much to Black Nail's surprise, Cedar signaled that he should take the lead. Excitedly, the goblin took point and began to lead his master home. If they both survived he was sure to have earned a huge treat. Hopefully, it would be better than the berries the stupid mimic had chased them away from. Honor among Thieves 6. Black Nail traced their path back to the bandit camp by following their old scent trail. It was easy because he had an amazing nose and was the greatest goblin tracker ever. The goblin kept a sharp lookout for signs of danger and unknown smells as he trudged along through the forest. His master was depending on him to get them home safely. A sudden breeze blew through the trees causing some of them to sway and creak ominously. Black Nail froze in alarm. He stopped and stared at a tree up ahead of him. Had its movement just been the wind or had it been something more sinister? The tree definitely didn't seem to look right to Black Nail, not nearly tree-like enough. Was it another mimic? He got out his sling and started to spin it. He unleashed the stone and it whistled through the air and bounced off the tree with a dull thud, before falling down onto the dirt. Black Nail held his breath. Nothing else happened. The tree didn't split open, move around, try to eat him, or anything else threatening. He was still suspicious. It's not a mimic, Black Nail, Cedar remarked dryly from behind him. Just like the last 3 trees you checked. Black Nail sighed and walked under the tree. It didn't move or transform into a horrible abomination. Sometimes his master was just no fun. They continued on. The sunlight moved westward through the branches overhead as they reached the halfway point back. Black Nail was climbing over a large fallen tree trunk that was starting to rot into mulch when the barest traces of a scent suddenly caught his attention. He titled his head back and sniffed the air. At first he smelled nothing out of the ordinary, but after a moment a scent he knew well filled his nose. Excitedly, he stopped atop the log and stood up to get a good view of the woods. He scanned the ground and brush around him for the source of the smell. His heart started pounding as he searched. He saw a lot of roots, fallen logs, and small bushes, but no obvious threats. What is it? Cedar asked with alarm. He was in no shape for another fight and he knew it. Both his arms were heavily bandaged and he was walking with a limp. Goblins, many, Black Nail answered quietly. Several different complex emotions rose within him and mixed together chaotically. Part of him suddenly wanted to challenge the goblins for the territory. Another part of him knew that was dumb. He was outnumbered with only a wounded Cedar for backup and that they needed to get to camp. He hesitated. Do you smell a hobgoblin, Black Nail? Cedar asked him nervously. What? Black Nail turned to his master and gave him a questioning look. Dunno, he answered doubtfully. What's a hobgoblin? The old grey-haired scout gave him a surprised look back. You don't know what a hobgoblin is, he asked the goblin. Black Nail nodded in confirmation. He did not know this thing. Hey, do you smell a large strange goblin? Cedar asked carefully after a second of thought. Black Nail frowned. How was he supposed to smell how large a goblin was? Sometimes his master said some stupid things. No, master. None like that, Black Nail replied after taking another sniff. All the goblins he could smell seemed normal enough. His master looked relieved at the goblin's answer. Now, Black Nail really wanted to know what a hobgoblin was. It sounded interesting. Keep moving but be ready for a fight. We should be able to scare them away though, they're just, goblins, Cedar said with an awkward finish. Black Nail ignored the unplanned insult. He nodded to his master and jumped down from the log as he forged ahead through the woods. With an expectant smile, he drew his knife and held it ready in front of himself. Back in the humid darkness of the sewers when he had fought other goblins he had never had a weapon like this. It was so sharp, shiny, and dangerous. Cedar had drawn his own knife with his unbound arm as well. Black Nail could smell the goblins better now. There seemed to be at least 4 of them and they were definitely moving closer. They were probably investigating his scent and looking to kill the strange trespasser. The smell of his master's blood could also have convinced them an easy meal was nearby. They would get no easy meal from him. Black Nail closed his eyes and concentrated on his hearing. From within the darkness behind his own eyelids, he heard the scrunch of dead leaves being crushed and the sound of soft footsteps on dry dirt. He spun around and opened his eyes but didn't see anything. Black Nail narrowed his eyes warily as he scanned the surrounding bushes and trees for any signs of the goblins stalking them. He could feel them watching him. Every instinct he had was telling him there were hostile goblins around. Out the corner of his eye, a green blur suddenly shot out from below some tangled roots and raced towards him. Black Nail reacted quickly and jumped away, just as the attacking goblin smashed its large wooden club down onto the ground by his feet. The club was made from a large twisted branch and looked like it would have really hurt had it hit. The feral goblin's long green ears went flat and it snarled viciously at Black Nail. He was unfazed though, and hissed a challenge right back. It was time to show this ugly wimp who was the toughest goblin around. Black Nail wasted no time and eagerly launched himself at his opponent. He intended to counterattack before the other goblin could recover from missing with his club. As he charged, Black Nail got a good look at his first forest goblin. The goblin was a slightly greener shade than him, completely naked, and ugly as mashed worms. Black Nail's face had the same long nose, thick brow, and squinty eyes but they looked much better on him. Black Nail's smile grew wider and he bared his teeth as he took in his opponent. He was bigger than this naked little runt. It should be an easy fight, and that was his favorite kind. As Black Nail moved to complete his counterattack and stab his attacker, something hit him from behind. He snarled and turned to see that another goblin had tackled him from behind. Hey, that was cheating. Cowards. Black Nail hissed as this new goblin and he got tangled together and went flying off to the side. They rolled across the ground. His new opponent tried to smash his head in with a sharp pointy rock, but Black Nail grabbed his arm and stopped the blow. This fight was his. He and his opponent then fought and clawed at each other as their momentum carried them through a prickly bush. The feral was too wary of Black Nail's blade to let himself get stabbed. Together, they then tumbled and smashed into the bottom of a thick standing tree. Black Nail was stunned and lost his grip on the other goblin for a second. Luckily, his opponent wasn't any better off. The two goblins fell apart, took a few seconds to recover, and got to their feet again. The feral goblin still had his pointy rock clenched tightly in one of his fists and Black Nail had his knife. Rarg, the naked green pipsqueak yelled as he raised it above his head and charged. No quarter. Black Nail shouted back as he ducked under the rock. It was something he had heard the bandits yell during fights. He then tackled his opponent to the ground and bit him. His teeth sank into the flesh under the other goblin's arm, where he couldn't be hit by his opponent's rock. The taste of iron filled Black Nail's mouth as he drew blood. It excited him. He was winning. The other goblin yelped loudly in pain and tried to pull away. Without mercy, Black Nail withdrew his teeth and stabbed his opponent in the shoulder with his blade. He had been aiming for the other goblin's neck. Regardless, the rock-wielding goblin fell wailing to the ground. Blood dribbled from his side where he'd been bitten and the shoulder where he'd been stabbed. Black Nail spat blood onto the ground and wiped his mouth clean as he looked triumphantly down on his defeated opponent. Victory was his. Black Nail was now breathing hard and had several new scratches that burned painfully. The other goblin's nails had been very sharp. As he sucked down air, he was alarmed to hear the crackle of leaves behind him. He spun around just in time to duck out of the way of a surprise attack. The branch-wielding goblin had rejoined the fight. Black Nail felt the club whoosh by his head as he ducked under it. Right, he had almost forgotten about that guy. How silly of him. As he scrambled away from the club, he saw his master Cedar attempting to fight 3 other goblins. They circled around the man wielding long wooden spears. Damnation, you bloody little bastards, Cedar swore in frustration. He was obviously having trouble defending himself from all 3 of them. The old scout only had one usable arm which held a long dagger. He looked exhausted as he hopped around avoiding the goblin's clumsy spear thrusts. Black Nail had to focus on his own fight, though. The club wielder rushed him again. Instead of dodging again, Black Nail leaped forward before the other goblin was ready and tackled him. They both fell over but Black Nail landed on top. He then easily managed to block the other goblin's clumsy swings, as they were too close together for the club to be swung properly. Black Nail put all his weight on the other goblin's chest. Spittle flew from the feral's mouth as he screeched and tried to bite Black Nail with his broken yellow teeth, but Black Nail held him down. He had a strong one-handed grip around the feral goblin's throat. The fight ended as Black Nail brought up his free hand and stabbed his opponent savagely up and under the ribs as Cedar had taught him. Then he did it again several times just to be sure. Blood poured out of the wound onto the ground. The club wielder twitched and choked before going still and limp. Black Nail chuckled happily. Truly, he was a strong goblin. He'd defeated 2 other goblins by himself. As Black Nail rose to his feet, he turned to face the 3 goblins attacking his master. However, they took one look at him standing over their 2 defeated packmates and fled. They scampered off into the woods with a quick series of fearful yelps. The wounded goblin also managed to get to his feet and dive back under the roots the first goblin had hidden in. Black Nail watched him go and saw that there was a burrow under there. He felt no desire whatsoever to try and chase the wounded goblin underground. That would be too much work. Well, this hasn't been a good day for me, Cedar remarked tiredly. The old scout was swaying unsteadily but he was still standing. The goblin's crude spears hadn't pierced his leather armor but they'd still hurt when they had jabbed him, and they had jabbed him a lot. Black Nail smiled up at his master as excitement overcame him. We win. I win. I stab, bite, and win. Black Nail exclaimed joyfully with a little hop. He had shown those other goblins who owned this territory. He did. Cedar just gave Black Nail a tired look. Well, we're still alive anyway. Let's hurry back. I need a drink, and medical attention, Cedar grunted. With a shrug, Black Nail did as he was told and headed towards the camp. He had his own cuts and scrapes but none of them were too serious. They were just proof of his strength and toughness. Cedar moved even slower now as he hobbled after Black Nail. Both exhaustion and pain from his new wounds slowed him, minor though they seemed. The old scout muttered and grumbled as he walked. Black Nail thought his master should be happier that they had won, but he had come to realize his master was kind of grumpy for a human. Black Nail strutted confidently through the woods now. His earlier victory had intoxicated him. He was the strongest goblin around. The toughest in the entire forest. He still kept his eyes open but his usual fear of the forest had subsided for now. An unexpected glimmer of color among the green to his left caught his eye. Shiny. He wandered over to get a better look. The thing was small, about the size of his fist, and many different sparkling colors. It seemed to reflect the light in a rainbow hue. As he moved, Black Nail heard a grunt behind him. Bat, Black Nail. Come back. Stay on the trail, Cedar shouted before a fit of coughing overtook him. Black Nail looked back with concern. He really should turn around. With regret he turned back away from the shiny thing. Knowing this forest, it was probably some sort of horrific murder trap anyway. As he walked back to Cedar, he heard a whirring sound from behind him. With a panicked twitch, Black Nail threw himself off to the side. He rolled and scrambled through the dirt before getting to his feet and turning to see what was attacking him. The shiny object he had seen flew past him. As he watched, the small colorful thing buzzed over to a tree and landed on it. It was a bug. Oh, he recognized it now. Black Nail felt really embarrassed. He threw a quick glance back towards his master. Cedar was glowering impatiently at him. The bug on the tree was large and its wings shone with different colors as the light hit it. It looked like a cross between a beetle and an ant, and it had huge sharp-looking mandibles. Black Nail had seen plenty of them underground in the sewers. One of his main jobs had been to exterminate them. They tended to build large nests that blocked pipes, and drill holes through other pipes. His old masters hadn't liked them much. They were also poisonous, so you couldn't even eat them. Out of habit, the goblin drew his sling to kill it. Stop, Black Nail! Cedar shouted suddenly as Black Nail was in mid-swing. The goblin stopped and looked over to his master with a confused expression on his face. It's bad luck to kill a harvester. They're sacred to the gods, Cedar explained to the befuddled goblin. Black Nail considered that. If killing bugs made spirits angry, it would explain all his bad luck, and how he had ended up in the forest. That made sense, no more shiny bug smashing for him. He lowered his sling. Meanwhile, the harvester crawled up the tree bark until it reached a small green shoot. Using its pincers, it snipped off the shoot and then took flight. Black Nail watched it zoom away off into the bushes with a bit of plant in its mouth. It will be taking that to its underground hive where it will rot and be used to grow mushrooms. That's why it's sacred to both Terranan of growing things, and Cordias of darkness, Cedar explained reverently. Black Nail gave Cedar a confused look. So this Terranan and Cordias were spirits? It figured that humans named spirits, they certainly named everything else. Cedar met his gaze and gave a pained chuckle. I'm not going to try and explain the gods to a goblin. No offense, Black Nail. Now let's get going, Cedar told him sternly. With a shrug, Black Nail moved back onto the path and began to guide Cedar back to camp again. He didn't really feel the need to learn the names of spirits anyway. It seemed kind of pointless to him. Spirits watched you and did what they wanted whether you knew their names or not. As they moved, Cedar began to limp more and more. He was also noticeably slowing down. Black Nail began to grow concerned that his master wouldn't make it back to camp. Dragging him would be a lot of work. Luckily, Black Nail soon heard the sound of human voices through the underbrush. His long pointy ears detected the noise before Cedar did. He scampered off into the bushes to check it out. Hey, where are going? Come back, Black Nail. Cedar shouted after him. Hear voices. Be right back, Black Nail responded. He peered out from behind a tree and saw a group of rough-looking humans moving around the forest. It took him a second, but he recognized several of them, mostly by their strong smell. Smiling in relief, Black Nail turned and ran back to his master. This way. Band this way, Black Nail told Cedar happily as he ran up to him. Cedar gave him an annoyed look but began to walk in the direction Black Nail indicated. They soon ran into the other bandits, who were obviously searchers out looking for the cave. There were a dozen of them spread over a small area checking under bushes and behind rocks for crevices or caves. As Cedar and Black Nail approached, one of them looked up and gave them an amused look. What in all creation happened to you, and should I be worried? There isn't a pissed-off Drake chasing you, I hope, the man asked Cedar as he took in their exhausted and ragged state. Cedar's clothes were cut and covered in blood. His one arm was also in a sling. Black Nail had his own share of bloodstains and scratches as well. Cedar scowled back at the man. We'll be fine, thanks for asking, and there is no Drake. We just walked into a mimic and then a bunch of feral goblins decided we looked like a free meal, Cedar replied dryly. Black Nail nodded in agreement as his master spoke. He would have noticed a Drake. He had heard they were pretty big. Well, I hope that mimic isn't around here. Also, don't look now, but I think one of those goblins is still following you, the man told Cedar with a smile as he pointed to Black Nail. Cedar gave the man an entirely unamused look back. I'm not in the mood for jokes, the old scout replied. The mimic is 2 hours walk away, so don't worry. This area should be fairly clear for several miles, but I'm heading back to camp to get myself fixed up so you're on your own out here. I would appreciate you sending someone back with us just in case, though. The other man shrugged and agreed to send someone back with them. He called a lanky bandit over and the three of them then headed back to camp together. Try not to trip into any more monsters, Cedar, the bandit joked as they walked away. Cedar turned and scowled at the man. Good luck out here without a guide. I have some advice for you. When you inevitably find a troll in the next bush you search, you should scream really loudly. Then everyone will know what direction to run away from, Cedar shot back before stomping off. They soon made it back to camp without any more surprises or encounters. Once there, Cedar had his wounds cleaned and stitched up. After that they both had dinner and took the rest of the day off. It eventually grew dark and Cedar fell asleep beside the remains of their fire. He had been too tired to even make it into his tent. Black Nail grinned happily as he curled up beside his master. This had been one of his favorite days ever. He was Black Nail, the strongest goblin of them all. Honor among Thieves 7. Over the next few days Harad was in an even worse mood than usual, which was truly frightening. Bandits who hadn't left the camp for weeks began volunteering for watch or scouting duty. The base became noticeably emptier. The bandit chieftain had really wanted to raid the crystal cave for treasures to sell. No one had managed to find it, though. She had glared at Cedar when the last group of searchers had reported back. She was either furious at him for wasting her time or suspected that he'd somehow concealed the cave. It didn't help that the old scout had made plain his relief that no one had found the cave. Black Nail spent a great deal of time checking the snares out in the woods during this time. Sometimes Cedar joined him. Her bad mood continued for days until the merchants from Riverdown finally arrived. Scouts that were posted to the road sent word of their approach. Harad immediately had the camp upended and reorganized for their arrival. She wanted to impress her guests. Extra guards were stationed at the road barricades that had been built earlier. The camp and even the bandits themselves were cleaned up as much as possible. Not that the bandits cleaned up particularly well, but at least most of the smell of piss and vomit was removed. During the time the bandits had occupied their current camp they hadn't been totally unproductive. Harad's base had been improved and built up a fair bit. It wasn't like they had much else to do with their time, so they'd managed to put some effort into making themselves more comfortable. The primitive lean-tos the forward party had constructed had been patched up and improved. Many had been divided into personal rooms with hanging hide or canvas doors. More of them had been built as well, so that every bandit had somewhere sheltered to sleep out of the wind and rain. Trees had been cleared for timber and piled up for firewood as well. Several crude pavilions made from wagon tarps and long posts had been put up for storage or gatherings. All in all the camp looked much more permanent, and less like an overnight campsite. Black Nail was there when the merchants arrived. He was doing one of the many chores Cedar had him constantly performing. Behind him, Cedar was sitting in front of his tent and idly whittling away at a piece of wood. Most of outlaws in the band were around except for those on watch. Harad wanted a show of force, so every bandit not on watch or scouting was in camp. The convoy arrived around midday when the sun was almost straight up in the sky. Half a dozen wagons rolled down the dusty road and stopped out in front of the old farmhouse. Most the wagons were only lightly loaded, the merchants were here to buy not sell. What they lacked in goods though they made up for in bodies. Dozens of people accompanied the wagons, and a lot of them were very shiny. Sunlight flashed off their armor as they moved. After a closer look, Black Nail realized that almost every human in the merchant's caravan was heavily armed. All in all, the bandits outnumbered the black market traders more than 2 to 1, but the guards had far better equipment, including chainmail and steel breastplates. They also looked more professional and disciplined. The guards stood tall and regarded the brigands before them expressionlessly, without showing a hint of concern at being so outnumbered. A small skinny man with a goatee stepped down from the lead cart. With a gesture he summoned a dozen guards to him and made his way forward. Herad frowned when she saw him, but stepped forward to meet him. A dozen of her larger and better armed thugs followed her. When the merchant and Herad met they exchanged a polite handshake. The guards and bandits glared at each other from behind their masters' backs, but both Herad and the small man ignored them completely. Black Nail had a sudden urge to run up and join the thugs in giving the guards evil looks. Maybe he could climb up onto one of the bandits' shoulders for a better view while he was at it. It seemed like a fun idea, but he resisted the urge. "Persis, I'm glad to see you," Herad told the man whose hand she was shaking. "I always enjoy laying eyes on you as well, Herad," the man replied with a slight leer. Herad smiled back at him, but her one hand moved subtly closer to her knives. "It's good of you to come all this way. You won't be disappointed with what we have for you," she told him. "Ah well, I'm afraid I'm usually disappointed when it comes to that. I always want more than others are willing to let me have," he said with a theatrical sigh. "That may be why I find myself dealing in black market goods," he then added with a chuckle. "Well, be that as it may, I think you will be pleasantly surprised at what we have for you here. You should be able to sell it for quite the profit," Herad told him. "Ah, that's wonderful to hear, but you know sometimes life is about more than just profit. Don't you think?" he responded with another smirk. Herad's smile froze. "An odd thing for a merchant to say. I'm not sure your company would approve," Herad replied. She couldn't quite keep the hostility out of her voice. "Tisk. Well, they're not here, are they? Anyway, they don't need to worry, since I always earn them a tidy sum," Persis responded. "I'm sure that's true. Let's get out of the sun, shall we? I have a list of goods inside. We can go over it and then inspect the physical items after," Herad suggested. She clearly wanted to get down to business, but Persis didn't seem to be in a hurry. The usually in control and violent Herad seemed to be acting very cautiously around this small man. Black Nail couldn't really understand why. As far as he could figure it, the merchant was only the leader of a tribe they were trading with. He also seemed to have less men than Herad, even if they were much shinier. So, why was Herad acting so un-Herad-like? Black Nail heard Cedar mutter something and turned to see his master glowering at the small merchant. Was Persis his master's enemy? Black Nail turned back to Persis when the man started talking again. "I hope you have some refreshments. It's been a terribly long and odious ride here. I would greatly enjoy a drink and some company before getting down to business," Persis replied while feigning a haggard tone. "Of course. We liberated a few good bottles on our last expedition. Just this way, Persis," Herad answered with a wave in the direction of the farmhouse. The merchant sniffed disdainfully when he saw it. "A barbaric piece of shelter if I ever saw one, but I suppose it will have to do. Some allowances must be made since we are so far from real civilization out here, after all," he said with a sigh. Herad led him to the door and they entered together. The thugs took up position outside. The guards however attempted to enter after their master, but Persis waved them off. "I'll be fine. Stay out here and wait for me," he commanded with a snap of his fingers before disappearing inside. Herad had commanded that all the bandits should watch the merchant's guards while looking busy and professional. Thus, more bandits were on watch than usual. Many of them were standing or sitting around the camp in small, but not so casual groups, that just so happened to be facing the caravan most of the time. The guards themselves seemed to sense the hostility because they didn't even bother to pretend to relax. They all stood strategically around the caravan at attention with hands on weapons. They were ready for any trouble, and the bandits looked like they wanted to cause it. Since everyone else seemed to be just hanging around, Black Nail took this time to relax as well. He yawned and walked over to a pile of firewood. There between the logs he cleared a patch of earth and gathered dry grass for a bed. Then he curled up and swiftly fell asleep with the pleasant earthy smell of drying wood filling his nostrils. He was awoken from his pleasant dreams by the noise of the wagons being loaded. Looking up, Black Nail noticed that the sun had moved through the clear blue sky a fair bit, meaning 2 or 3 hours had passed. He got up, stretched, and looked around. Hopefully, he hadn't missed anything exciting while he napped. Black Nail saw that Herad and Persis were out inspecting the goods. They also seemed to be arguing back and forth about prices. Ugh, boring. By this point Herd looked very tired of dealing with Persis. She was openly glaring at him as they argued and her voice seemed strained. Black Nail was honestly surprised she hadn't stabbed the small man. Black Nail knew that was how she usually dealt with people who annoyed her. She was very efficient for a human. Members of Herad's bandit troop were loading the stolen goods onto Persis' wagon, while his guards looked on. The bandits didn't seem happy about doing the work alone. This went on for a while as Persis's wagons got piled high with more and more cargo. Eventually, the last piece of stolen goods he wanted to purchase was loaded up and secured. Several crates and items he didn't want, or didn't want to pay enough for, were left lying around. It was a pleasure doing business with you, Mistress Herad, Persis told her as they were finishing up. You can be a vexing bargainer, but I look forward to dealing with you again, Herad replied politely. Her voice contained a hint of hostility, though. Persis extended a hand and they shook again. As Herad tried to withdraw her arm, the merchant pulled it up and kissed the back of her hand. She gave him a cold look, but he simply smirked back at her before letting go. Then as we agreed, 167 gold Elarians, of which half are payable now and half will be deposited at the river down bank for you upon my safe arrival, he told her. Persis then signaled to a pair of guards and they brought forth a large chest. He pulled a large key from a cord around his neck and unlocked it. From inside, he took out several bags and counted out a few coins. He handed the coins to Herad and left the heavier bags there on the ground before locking the chest up again and slipping the key into his pocket. The chest was largely empty when he closed it. Herad went through the bags and gave them a brief inspection. She appeared satisfied with the results. I wish you a safe journey home then, Persis, Herad told the merchant as she finished. Persis rolled his eyes in response. Of course you do, Herad. That's the entire point, the small neatly dressed man commented dryly before walking back to his wagon. On his way he strode past Blacknail's hiding spot in the woodpile. The goblin hid himself as the man approached. He was pretty sure that his master and everyone else didn't like the tiny outsider. In Blacknail's mind that made him practically an enemy, and thus fair game. As Persis passed by his hiding spot, Blacknail darted out and his hand reached out to swiftly liberate the contents of the merchant's pockets. The man didn't notice and continued walking on, unaware that he was suddenly ever so slightly lighter. The goblin sniggered as he retreated with his prizes. After Persis had spent a few minutes yelling orders at his underlings, his caravan got itself organized and started back down the road they had come from. Blacknail watched the merchant carefully until they were gone, but the stupid man never checked his pockets. The goblin then broke out into a grin. The prizes were all his. Excitedly, Blacknail opened his hand and examined his new property. He'd gotten the shiny yellow key. He also had a bunch of mixed coins of various sizes and colors. That was a lot of shinies. Grinning in joy, the goblin stuffed his new possessions into one of his pouches for safekeeping. Now that the merchant was gone, Cedar walked over to Herad. She gave him an irritated look as he approached, but her earlier bad mood seemed somewhat mollified by the large pile of gold in front of her. Apparently, she liked shinies as well. I hate that money-grabbing little rat. Why couldn't the company have sent someone else? Cedar remarked coldly. He's a pig, but played right he pays more than some of their other representatives, and that's what matters, Herad replied scornfully. Well, one day I hope to meet him out in the woods where there are no witnesses or guards. So I can shoot him, he told her. Herad turned away from him and began giving orders, but Blacknail could see she was smiling slightly. Or at least he thought it was a smile, he couldn't be sure since it was the first time he had seen anything like it on her face. Under Herad's directions, the gold was soon packed away and the camp reorganized. Most of the men looked excited and expectant. Cedar and Herad were then joined by another outlaw who Blacknail knew had somehow earned the name Red Dog. Of course Red Dog wasn't red and didn't have a dog. Humans were weird. Red Dog was a tall man, but shorter than Cedar, with unruly brown hair. He also somehow managed to be one of the few bandits in camp that had pudgy cheeks. Living in the wild tended to strip the fat from most men, but apparently not from him. What's the plan now, boss? The men are going to want their share of the gold and a chance to spend it, Red Dog asked her cheerfully. And they'll get it. When I say they can, Herad told him sternly. Red Dog fidgeted uncomfortably. What's the problem? We're only a day away from Riverdown, and they're a typical frontier city. If we keep our heads low then we shouldn't have problems with the law. We've been there before, he remarked. We can't all go at once. We'll be staying out here until winter starts to set in, then we'll head north to Dagger Point. Until then I'll pay and detach a few men at a time to the city for leave. If I pay them all now they'll just start fighting over it, she told him after a moment of reflection. Red Dog nodded in acceptance. He clearly had been expecting something like that. Cedar however had a question or two. We're staying here? That seems a bit risky. What about our next score, he asked. I had a talk with Persis while I was entertaining him, Herad explained. On top of getting an interesting letter from him, I also managed to get quite a bit of useful info out of the worm, like the routes and times for several caravans over the next month. Nice, Red Dog remarked. Yes, it seems the Palantians are pressing the Elarians hard right now, the bandit chieftain remarked with a fierce smile. Most of their troops have been pulled out of the north to reinforce the border, and they already barely have enough for patrols. The local lords, such that they are, have enough problems of their own as well. Leaving us free to run wild, Red Dog added with a predatory smile of his own. Trade will probably dry up once the merchants realize how unsafe it is, Cedar observed coolly. We'll split the band and send out some smaller groups to hit smaller targets if it comes to that, Herad answered with a shrug. Cedar frowned but nodded. I don't think we need to be worried about that. Merchants are all a bunch of greedy bastards who aren't nearly as smart as they like to think they are, Red Dog interjected cheerfully. Blacknail got bored and wandered off after that. Several days passed with nothing exciting happening, just a lot of chores. Cedar kept the goblin busy and didn't seem interested in going into town. Things finally picked up when a group of scouts rode into camp with word of a potential target. Herad quickly summoned several of her lieutenants to a meeting. Cedar was among them and as usual Blacknail was his shadow. Also, Red Dog and Vorshaw attended. Cleven's group was set to watch the road south from Brackkenmount, Harad told everyone. Persis said that they would soon be sending a big shipment of weapons south. Now, Bracken Mount doesn't produce nearly as many weapons as it did before Coriolis was destroyed, but the haul should still be considerable. We could always use more weapons. Tools of our trade they are, Red Dog commented. We would be better served by blankets and boots, Cedar pointed out dryly. True enough, but robbing a blanket caravan wouldn't be nearly as profitable, Red Dog replied with a chuckle. Vorshaw laughed with him, until Harad gave them both a dark look and they quickly quieted down. A shipment like this will be meant for the front line, and that means it will be heavily guarded. Maybe even an army escort, including combat mages and sloshers, Cedar warned the others. Red Dog frowned in concern, but Harad just nodded. Possibly, there are troops in town, but no one seems to know how many will go with the caravan, if any, she told them, apparently unconcerned. What's the most the army boys could bring to the table? Vorshaw asked her boss thoughtfully. At most they could spare a full platoon, so less than 50 men. As for mages and vessels, who knows? Harad answered with emphasis on the proper name of elixir users. She didn't seem to approve of the slang word for them, most likely because she thought it disrespectful to herself because she was one. Probably not many, Red Dog commented. We could take a platoon, but it would bleed us, and I'm not sure about any mages. Those guys can do a lot of bloody damage and it would already be a close thing, Vorshaw mused aloud. So we don't attack if they're too strong. We can always check them out and retreat if they're too much trouble, or attack from ambush, Red Dog suggested. I was already talking about an ambush, Vorshaw replied with a roll of her eyes. We could put men in a town on the way and get them to ply the guards with drink when they stop for the night, Cedar suggested. We then mark the mages and slosh vessels and take them out first when the fight starts or before it. Harad scowled as the old scout talked, but apparently didn't find any fault with what he said. Yes, cunning and ruthless is the way to do it, she reluctantly agreed. Fair fights are for knights and nobles in stories. We could also use poison, and if the town they stop at is small enough we could pillage it as a bonus. That could get messy, Cedar commented critically as he frowned. As long as we get the shipment I couldn't care less. If you don't have the stomach for it then you can stay here, Harad told him with a cold unemotional look. The others looked away from Cedar and stayed silent. No one backed him up against their boss. We'll get ready to head out immediately, Harad ordered everyone. We need to be well ahead of them for this to work out correctly. Cedar, you'll take charge of the camp when I'm gone. Vorshaw and Red, you're both with me. Cedar looked dissatisfied but could do nothing but agree. Behind him, Black Nail tried to keep out of Harad's sight. She looked even meaner than usual. At daybreak the next day, most the bandits marched out of camp. It was an overcast morning and the birds were singing loudly in the trees. The bandit base felt empty to Black Nail. Very few people were left in the camp with Cedar and him. Hopefully, nothing would go wrong while most the tribe were away. Honor among thieves 8. The next few days were very boring. Harad was gone and she had taken most the other bandits with her. Black Nail spent his time doing chores and, when boredom caused his curiosity to overcome his self-preservation, a little exploring. One afternoon, as Black Nail was walking over to his master's tent. He had been out in the forest gathering some plants for Cedar. He didn't know why his master wanted them, they certainly didn't taste very good, he had checked. Suddenly, the loud crack of wood splintering startled the goblin and caused him to flinch. The first noise was soon followed by the sound of panicked human yelling. That was almost never good. Black Nail grew concerned. Then he realized the noise was coming from the nearby forest, and it was getting closer. He immediately started to run away. Just to be safe. He made straight for his master, but the noise steadily grew closer. The nervous goblin risked a glance backwards and saw a scout burst from the edge of the forest and run frantically into the clearing. The man's face was pale with terror and he was gasping for breath. Not good, something bad was about to happen and he wanted as far away from it as possible. Black Nail tried to run faster. His little legs pumped frantically. Help, the scout yelled desperately between gasping breaths. The goblin was pretty sure the man wasn't talking to him, so he just kept running away. The camp came alive with movement and shouting as others noticed the commotion. Suddenly, Black Nail heard several bandits swear or shout in surprise. He couldn't help but shoot another panicked look over his shoulder to find out what the men had seen. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like it. He was not disappointed. The forest exploded and massive creature barreled out of the bushes. It was headed straight for the running scout. The beast snorted and squealed in rage as it tried to run the fleeing man down. The scout was, of course, leading it straight towards Black Nail. The creature was as tall as a man and heavy with both muscle and fat. It easily weighed more than a horse. Its body was covered in dark brown spiky hair that was especially long and bristly on its back. It also had a flat snout protruding from its face, because it was a giant pig. Even with its unbelievable mass the boar moved frighteningly quickly. Black Nail had no doubt that anyone hit by it would be smashed into paste, and then crushed under its hooves. That was, of course, if they weren't first impaled on the long yellow tusks that jutted forward out of its mouth. Black Nail was running on all fours now as both panic and adrenaline set in. Both the scout and the huge pig were gaining on him. Cedar had risen to his feet and was now quickly going through his things. Black Nail raced past an empty tent. He really hoped his master would do something soon, as in really soon. He didn't want to be trampled to death by a giant pig. From just behind him the running goblin heard a horrible scream of pain, which was quickly followed by a wet crunching sound and then a triumphant squeal. Ouch! Hopefully the beast would leave now that it had caught its target. Nope, the sound of heavy hooves pounding the earth continued towards Black Nail. Why did these things always happen to him? Bad piggy, don't chase me, the terrified little goblin wailed as he ran. Suddenly, there was the crack of a sling and a surprised squeal from the boar. One of the nearby bandits had hit the pig with a rock. With a furious grunt the boar shifted its beady-eyed gaze to the woman who had hit him. The woman's eyes widened as they met the small black eyes of the boar. You could practically see anger and hatred rise like steam from off the boar's back. It looked pissed. With a dreadful squeal that tore through the air, the beast switched targets and made for his assailant. After a brief second of looking very regretful of her recent life choices, the woman turned and fled. Her sudden departure surprised several bandits who had been standing right next to her. Hey, wait, one of them squeaked. Then the entire group of bandits turned and dashed away in every direction like a swarm of insects someone had just waved their hand through. None of them tried to stand their ground. Black Nail slowed to a jog. Whew, he needed catch his breath. The boar was no longer chasing him, thank the spirits. He should be safe for now. As the boar closed in on her, the woman dove behind a stack of solid wooden crates. This did not stop the boar. It hit the boxes at full speed with a thunderous cracking noise. The beast's long tusks scooped under the crates, and a jerk of its wide head launched them into the air. Its bulky body smashed right through the remaining boxes and crushed them under its hooves. An explosion of splinters was soon all that was left of them. The noise was deafening. Even from far away, Black Nail winced in pain as the sound assaulted his ears. The goblin couldn't see where the woman had ended up among all the debris. He didn't even know if she was still alive or not. If she was dead he would remember her fondly. She had probably saved his life after all. The boar apparently couldn't find her either. It snorted and stomped around the ruins of the crates for a few seconds before focusing his attention on the nearest visible bandit. A startlingly angry squeal escaped the beast's lips and then it charged after him. Oh hells, the man yelled as he desperately looked around for somewhere to hide. Much to Black Nail's alarm, the man started running in his direction. Eek, not again, the goblin cursed as he picked up speed. All the nearby bandits were either running away or hiding behind tents and equipment. Several had made for the old farmhouse and one was climbing a tree. It wasn't even a very large tree. After seeing the boar go through the pile of crates, Black Nail was pretty sure those were all terrible ideas. He just wished he had a better one. The man and the beast were quickly closing in on the small goblin, so Black Nail took off towards Cedar. Bad things from the forest were kind of his thing. The heavy beat of hooves closed in on Black Nail from behind. He wasn't going to make it to safety. No, what to do, the goblin squeaked as he started panicking. Black Nail then turned and dashed towards a nearby line of wooden lean-tos. They wouldn't stop the charging boar behind him, but maybe he could hide there. As the goblin dove into the nearest lean-to, the man running behind him leapt to the side. The bandit barely managed to avoid being impaled on the beast's tusks, but he landed safely. The boar didn't try and chase him. Instead, it hit the lean-tos full force. The crude wooden structures exploded as the beast smashed through them. From inside, Black Nail watched the small building come apart around him. Splinters and broken pieces of wood flew everywhere as the boar narrowly missed the goblin. Black Nail's eyes widened and he turned pale as a descending hoof narrowly missed his head. He stiffened in terror as the powerful musky smell of the boar and a deafening chorus of squeals washed over him. The terrified goblin shut his eyes and curled up into a ball, while wishing he was somewhere safe. There were no boars in his old lovely sewer home. Then the noise stopped and the beast was gone. It had passed through the shattered lean-tos and continued on. Black Nail's heartbeat was out of control and he started twitching uncontrollably. Was he still alive? He couldn't believe it. The goblin patted himself down, and was surprised to find his body still intact. Still somewhat stunned, he sat up and looked out from the ruins of the lean-to. The wide-eyed goblin watched as the beast continued to rampage through the bandits' camp. Black Nail noticed several arrows sticking out from the creature's hide. Those were new. Apparently, some of the humans were actually doing something other than running away in terror now. What idiots. The goblin was going to run the second the beast turned back in his direction. As he watched, several more arrows hit the boar. It grunted in pain and squealed angrily. The arrows were coming from almost every direction now as the bandits finally got organized. The constant painful pricks were confusing the beast, it couldn't focus on a single target. The squealing giant stomped and spun around in circles, as more and more arrows descended upon it. Before long, it began to slow and stumble as it bled out from an ever-increasing number of wounds. Then an arrow took it in the throat, and the boar collapsed. It gave one last gasping wheeze before shuddering and going still. Its gigantic fallen body was pierced by too many arrows to count. Cedar approached the fallen giant with sword in hand. He quickly stepped in and stabbed it under the ribs. The sword sank over halfway into the beast's side, but it didn't so much as twitch. Well, it's dead now, Cedar announced as he withdrew the blade. He then scowled sourly as looked around the now ravaged camp. Other outlaws cautiously began to approach the beast. Some of them had bows but others had just popped out of hiding and were unarmed. At least we'll eat well tonight, one of the bandits remarked, which earned him a few chuckles. True, but we're going to have a lot of cleaning up to do, Cedar replied. Black Nail shakily got up and wandered over as well. The goblin plopped down at his master's feet and leaned his head against Cedar's leg for support. He just felt like sitting there for a while, it felt nice and safe. We have at least one grave to dig, another bandit added with a look towards the remains of the boar's first victim. Black Nail looked over as well. He had realized a very important truth today, never hit a boar with a sling. With one of his usual annoyed grunts, Cedar took charge and got everyone started on cleaning up. There was a lot to do. The titanic boar had done a huge amount of damage, and it soon grew dark. Cedar had put himself in charge of cooking the boar. He had a giant spit roast made and the boar was cut up and put on it. When it was done he allowed everyone to stop for supper. Black Nail joined his master at their campfire. The smell of roasting meat was making the goblin drool all over himself. It smelled so nice. He wanted to bite into it so badly. Cedar saw the goblin and threw him a small piece of greasy meat. Black Nail caught it right out of the air with his mouth and instantly started chewing. The goblin shivered happily as smacked loudly. His mouth tingled with glorious deliciousness. Unfortunately, he soon swallowed the last bit of meat and his stomach wasn't full. The goblin opened his eyes wide and gave his master a pleading expression, but the man ignored him. Black Nail cried a little as he sat next to the fire. Why did his master never give him enough food? It wasn't like Cedar was a cruel master, far from it. Oh well, it was fine. Black Nail had a cunning plot in place to secure more food. He was going to go and beg from Geralt. It worked every time. After a brief walk around the now dark and campfire-lit camp, Black Nail found the man at his usual eating place. He was seated around a fire with several other men. The flickering flame illuminated their faces as they talked. Black Nail wandered over to Geralt. Normally he would be wary of approaching most the bandits, but the ones who had stayed behind with Cedar left him alone. Geralt was also easy to get food out of, and not very threatening. Geralt noticed the goblin approach and smiled at him. He reached over and picked up a piece of meat that had been set aside. Sit, Black Nail. Who is a good boy? Geralt asked sweetly. One of the other men groaned and another chuckled as Geralt spoke. Me, I'm a good boy, Black Nail answered happily as he took a seat at Geralt's feet. Geralt smiled again and tossed him the treat. As he chewed and slurped down the meat, Black Nail smirked. He clearly had Geralt well trained. It's not a bloody dog, Geralt. It's a goblin. They're very different, one of the bandits remarked in an irritated voice. He's a good little boy nonetheless, Geralt answered as he shrugged and petted Black Nail's head. It actually felt pretty good. Black Nail smiled toothily at the other man, which caused him to look exasperated and sigh loudly. I still don't understand why Cedar decided to get a goblin, or why Harad let him. It's not like every scout in the band wouldn't give their last prayer to be his partner, and I would have thought the boss would have said no, just to spite him, one man told the others as Geralt gave him a confused look. Why do Cedar and Harad have such a problem with each other's company anyway? Also, why in all the gods' names would every scout want to partner with a grumpy old man like Cedar? I mean, sure, he's the most experienced of our ever so hard-working scouts, but he's also more than a bit of an ass as well, Geralt asked. Most the men chuckled, but one gave a nervous glance at the darkness over his shoulder before replying. It was almost like he wanted to be very sure no one unexpected was listening. Well, you see, the answer to both those questions is sort of the same. You obviously don't know who Cedar is, or at least who he used to be, the man said quietly. Black Nail's ears twitched as he suddenly grew interested and started paying attention. He was almost done eating anyway. Geralt leaned in closer and he raised an eyebrow inquisitively, in an invitation for the man to keep speaking. Oh, who did our resident old-timer used to be then? Geralt asked with interest. Cedar used to run his own gang of thieves, years ago. They were one of the first successful bands, and they built quite a name up for themselves. That was way back, of course, when things were very different. Eventually, they all retired or died until only Cedar was left, was the other man's reply. You must be joking. Who would follow Cedar, and why would Harad have a problem with that? Geralt asked with disbelief. Think about it for a second. Every bandit chief's worst fear is being killed and replaced by one of their subordinates. Who could possibly feel secure knowing someone in their band used to be a successful leader? The other bandit pointed out. That's a good point. Harad has always struck me as more than a little paranoid. However, if Cedar used to be so famous, why is he serving under Harad, instead of leading his own band? Geralt asked. It was different man that answered this time. He had remained quiet until now, but Black Nail recognized him as one of the older scouts. Cedar is an odd sort bandit, the scout explained. He didn't become an outlaw because he was wanted or for the money, although he certainly got both. No, he chose to become an outlaw because he was a northern patriot. He was fighting the control of the north by Eloria and Divshur. I'd guess he's serving under Harad because he has nowhere else to go. He's more at home out here in the wilds than in any city, and he won't surrender and live under the southern boot. He stopped and took a quick drink from the cup in his hand before continuing. Everyone waited expectantly for him to finish. As for why he's not the band's leader, well, that's simple, it's because the age of rebellion and causes is pretty much dead. We're fighting for money and power, and no one is more dedicated to that than Harad. Of course, that means that under her we do a lot of things Cedar doesn't approve of, the scout told them. Gerard leaned back again with a contemplative look on his face. Everyone around the fire was silent. Only the crackle of the fire and the chirp of insects could be heard. That's quite the story indeed. It really can't picture Cedar as any type of leader, but I don't think you are all lying to me. It would certainly explain a lot as well, Gerald responded after a minute or so of thought. Well, whether you believe it or not, it's all true. Just don't go mentioning any of this where Cedar or Harad could hear you. If you enjoy living, that is, the first speaker replied with shrug. I'm not a complete and utter moron, Geralt had said with a roll of his eyes. Black Nail was curled up close to the fire and deep in thought about what he had just heard. So his master had been a chieftain, until he had lost some sort of fight and ended up alone. Harad had let him in her tribe, but she didn't completely trust him not to challenge her. That made sense to Black Nail, it was sort of goblin-like. Fine, if you can keep it to yourself then I will tell you the best part, one of the men told an intrigued-looking Geralt. You see, Cedar's band wasn't just a... Suddenly, a cloaked figure swept out from the shadows. Everyone around the fire jerked in surprise, or sprung to their feet with looks of alarm on their faces. Cedar glared at them as he stopped and surveyed the group. Most the bandits wilted guiltily under his gaze. Geralt gave him a weak smile. Oh hey, Cedar. We were just, talking about some things that had noth, he began to explain but Cedar cut him off. I don't care, he said as he glowered at them. His brows were scrunched together angrily but his voice seemed to contain a hint of worry. 2 of the men are missing. They were seen after the attack and weren't together. Something entered the camp and dragged them away. Honor among thieves 9. No one got a lot of sleep that night, and not just because the watch was doubled. Everyone was too on edge to relax. The only exception to this was Black Nail. He was reasonably certain that with all the big pink humans running around nothing would bother going after a skinny little goblin. Also, if anything really dangerous attacked the camp then all the human screams would wake him up. When dawn finally brightened the camp, Cedar led a search party out to look for traces of the missing men. After an extensive search they found nothing, not even the smallest signs of a struggle. I really don't like this, one of the scouts told Cedar. As was usual when Cedar was talking to people, Black Nail followed his master quietly and listened in. Everyone ignored him unless he spoke up. Who would? Cedar replied with a grunt. True, but what I meant is that it's one thing for something to kill 2 men, but it's another thing entirely for something to do it while leaving absolutely no tracks. Your goblin couldn't even smell anything, Cedar. The scout continued excitedly. Maybe they walked off together. Could have been bedmates or something, someone else guessed. That's bloody disgusting. John was my friend and he was no bugger. He also sure as all hells wouldn't have gone walking out into the forest in the middle of the night without telling anyone, another bandit answered angrily. There ain't anything wrong with 2 men sharing a bed out here. The god Slyph himself smiles upon it. It's just like sailors when they're out at sea, the first man began arguing defensively. You're like the only follower of that god in the entire camp, the other bandit countered angrily. Most of us are soldiers. We follow the Azawach, the war god, and he doesn't look so kindly upon such things. It's undisciplined and plain unhealthy. Ha, we're thieves now, even if we used to be soldiers. Most the band worships Cordius, and he doesn't care what people do in darkness, a third bandit added dismissively. This isn't relevant, Cedar remarked sternly as he cut off any further argument. A few hostile looks were exchanged but all the other bandits stopped arguing. Cedar was in charge and they had a job to do. I hate to be the one to say it, but this is looking more and more like the work of someone in the band, a mustached man remarked, which caused several others to give him annoyed looks. So, someone just decided to murder 2 men who barely knew each other and were on opposite ends of the camp, a short bandit countered. It does seem unlikely, but they must have been in on something together. Murder would explain the lack of anything but human tracks, and nothing else will, the mustached bandit responded with a suspicious glance at the man arguing with him. Not necessarily, Cedar mused aloud. Everyone else grew quiet. Most of the bandits looked confused, but a few of the more experienced scouts looked grim or upset instead. Well, feel free to enlighten us, Cedar, someone eventually said to break the silence. I can think of a few things it could have been. Firstly, it could have been some sort of crystal host with a weird power, Cedar explained. The outlaws threw each other questioning looks and spoke among themselves for a few seconds. They didn't seem convinced. That's only one thing. What are the others? Someone asked. We'll cross that bridge when we come upon it, Cedar replied grimly. A crystal mutant can't be our best option, someone muttered skeptically. Leave it alone, you don't want to know, an older voice responded. Just then the sound of hooves echoed down the road to the camp. Everyone looked up in time to see a horsewoman ride into the clearing. Several of the outlaws reached for weapons but they relaxed a bit when they recognized her as one of the women who had gone with Herad. After spotting Cedar and the group around him, the rider headed their way. She smiled at Cedar as she approached. Black Nail scowled at the horse. He didn't want the stinky thing to come any closer. Cedar, Herad sent me ahead. She's on her way back with the goods. The raid was a success, the rider told them. How long? Cedar asked her. They'll be a few hours if they keep up the pace they were holding when I left, the woman replied. Cedar didn't look any happier to know the rest of the band would be back soon. He scowled as he looked down the empty road. We should get ready for them then, Cedar told the other bandits. He waved them off after reminding them to never go anywhere alone and to always have a weapon on hand. Cedar then headed back to his campsite, and sent Black Nail out to check some meat he was smoking. The goblin headed over to where a thick pillar of grey smoke was rising from a small heap of evergreen branches. Excitedly, he pushed the branches away to reveal the pit and flame beneath them, but the meat hanging inside didn't look quite done. It also didn't taste fully cooked. With a disappointed grunt, the goblin returned the now nibbled meat and headed back to his master. He made it back to Cedar's campsite right before the return of the raid party. The first of the victorious bandits came down the road and immediately began finding places to collapse and rest. Most of them looked exhausted, and were dripping with sweat. Many of them also had some sort of injury bandaged up. The smell of sweat, blood, and pus was everywhere and filled the goblin's nose. He hadn't though the humans could smell any worse. Black Nail pinched his long green nose shut. Ew, had he ever been wrong? Cedar scowled as he took the scene in. He seemed to disapprove of the ragged state of the men and women. The last few bandits came down the road with a pair of wagons covered in tarps. Quite a few of them are missing, the old scout muttered with a hint of concern. Harad was at the very back of the returning bandits. The first thing the black-haired woman did when she came into sight was head Cedar's way. Vorsha and Red Dog followed closely behind her. Black Nail was shocked by Harad's bloodthirsty grin. For a second, he was afraid she was going to take a bite out of his master's face, but then he realized she was just in a good mood. He had never seen her smile before, and he didn't like it. The raid was a success, Cedar. The weapons are all mine, she gloated triumphantly as she marched towards the old scout and Black Nail. Good, we need them. I see you lost more than a few men, Cedar observed noncommittally. Harad just shrugged as she uncharacteristically ignored any criticism that could have been implied by the words. With 2 recent and profitable raids under our belts, recruiting to fill the holes in our ranks won't be a problem. It's not like there is a shortage of scum and thugs around here, she replied with a hint of condescension. Cedar frowned and Black Nail noticed Vorsha react with a scowl as well. Red Dog seemed to agree with Harad, though. All we need to do is recruit some more in Riverdown and the surrounding countryside. It's one of the main reasons we built this camp in the first place, so that we would have a place to lay low close to a city, he told the rest of them. True, but it's always better to keep the men we've got than to have to replace them with unknown, Vorsha started to add before Harad cut her off. Enough. Don't question my decisions. I promised every man and woman who joined my band a chance at plunder. The gods know I sure didn't offer them safety, Harad interjected, as she gave everyone a cold stare. The other men and women around her lowered their eyes in submission, and even Cedar nodded his grudging acceptance. So, what now then? Cedar asked her. Harad smiled fiercely again in response. Behind her, Red Dog and Vorsha gave each other uneasy glances. It was clear they were both apprehensive about something. Like Red Dog said, now we will start recruiting heavily. I want to do more than just replace our losses. It's time to build the band up into a real force to be reckoned with, she explained eagerly. Red Dog lips twisted into a concerned frown as he listened to Harad. He seemed hesitant to speak up, but his concern overcame his reluctance to question Harad. Begging your pardon, boss, but that doesn't seem like it's going to put more silver in our pockets. Having more men isn't really going to help us pull off more raids, but it will mean less loot for the rest of us, Red Dog commented carefully. The times are changing, and so it's time to change with them, Harad replied cryptically. Warwick, Cedar guessed grimly as his eyes narrowed with hostility. Harad nodded in confirmation of his response. Yes, Warwick. The man may be an idiot, but he's right about at least one thing. More and more deserters and criminals are headed north, but there's not enough room for them. All the bands are beginning to turn on each other as they fight for plunder. Even worse, all the good targets are disappearing. It's like what Cedar keeps bitching about, too much bloody banditry will just cause everyone to stop trading and leave. It's already happening, that's why we had to come so far south, she explained. So you want to build up our ranks so you can strike even further south? Cedar asked uncertainly. No, it's no longer about raiding caravans and quick gold, it's about territory. Out east Warwick is setting himself up like some sort of lord. Either we do the same or someone else will, and then we'll end up working for them or more likely dead, she explained. So what does that mean exactly? If we're not going to keep raiding caravans and villages, then what are we supposed to do? Red Dog asked as Harad gave him a patronizing look. Like I said, we hold territory and we make people pay for safe passage through it. That way we make a profit without driving all the merchants away. We'll make less from each caravan, but there will be more of them. I've already got a message from one merchant asking to pay protection fees, she told him. Vorsha looked skeptical. Cedar had gone totally quiet. Black Nail gave him a closer look and was surprised to see that the old scout seemed shocked about something. His weathered face had gone pale and slack. If we're promising safe passage, then we will have to enforce it. That means recruiting, driving away, or killing every other bandit group for leagues, Vorsha mused aloud. So, that's exactly what we'll do. We recruit more men and kill everyone who challenges us, Harad replied matter-of-factly. Well, the weapons we just stole and the gold we will get for selling them will sure come in handy now. You do realize this will eventually bring us into conflict with every other band of outlaws trying to the same thing, including Warwick, until there is only one bandit left on top, Vorsha said with an amused snort. Oh, I know that, Vorsha. If someone is going to be bandit lord of the north, then it's going to be me, Harad purred wickedly. She practically oozed bloodlust as she smiled. You're the boss. I'll follow where you lead, Red Dog told Harad quickly and nervously. Harad turned to look at Cedar. He was still deep in thought, and was looking down at the ground with one hand on his forehead. She frowned at him. You usually have something to say, Cedar, so say it, she told him. Black Nail's master looked up. You're the boss, he told her with a distracted manner. He seemed troubled by something and his eyes looked unfocused. Harad was a little taken aback by his response, and gave him an odd look. You finally going senile, Cedar, she asked him. His only reply was a grunt as he kept staring at the ground. An irritated look appeared on Harad's face, and a concerned one appeared on Vorsha's. Go take a nap, Cedar, if you're so tired. Would you mind updating me on how things went while I was gone, first though, she asked him impatiently. Cedar finally looked up and seemed to think her words over for a second. It was pretty quiet. Not much important happened. Last night though, 2 men went missing. I had a look around with some of the other scouts, but we couldn't find any traces of whatever grabbed them. It's probably still out there, he told her. That seems bloody important to me, Red Dog exclaimed anxiously. He then cast a look around the clearing as if he was expecting something to attack them then and there. Vorsha also looked taken aback and she frowned in concern. Harad cast an annoyed look at both Red Dog and Cedar. She drew one of her knives and casually flipped it through the air a few times. What do you think it is? She asked the old scout calmly. Black Nail thought he detected more than a little repressed hostility in her stance and voice. Cedar hesitated before answering. I don't want to guess, but since you're the one asking I don't have much choice, he replied with a grimace. It's bloody unlikely but it could be a mutant of some sort. It could also be one of the Florcarva, although again it's unlikely. Wait, are you serious? A startled Vorsha exclaimed. What's a Florcarva? Asked Red Dog in confusion as his tongue tripped over the word. One of the forest people, Harad answered for Cedar. She had started to look thoughtful. Those are real. Red Dog asked in surprise. Real as diamonds and death, just because people don't see them doesn't mean they aren't out there. One of them could have walked into camp and killed those men without leaving a trace, Cedar explained. But you don't think one did, do you? Harad asked Cedar suspiciously. The old scout shook his head. No, they haven't come this far south in over a century, and it doesn't seem like something they would do. It's too petty. They would have killed more people and wouldn't have taken the bodies away. Unfortunately, the most likely option by far is that it's, Cedar reluctantly told them before he was cut off. Ghouls, Harad hissed angrily. Red Dog went pale and took a step back. Vorsha started swearing and cursing non-stop, but Cedar just nodded grimly. The humans' reactions intrigued Black Nail. What were ghouls? Maybe something exciting was about to happen. I take it you didn't share these concerns with anyone, Harad asked him sharply as Cedar shook his head in answer. Well, at least you did that right. How sure are you? She asked. If it's ghouls then they'll strike again tonight, he replied emotionlessly. Harad nodded thoughtfully. Her short black hair fell in front of her eyes and she brushed it aside. Then we have a lot to do before nightfall, the bandit chieftain told her lieutenants. Harad took charge and began to lay out a plan. Before she let them go, Harad swore them all to secrecy. She forgot about Black Nail, but he had no idea what they had been talking about so it didn't matter. Also, he wasn't going to talk about something that would make Harad mad anyway. He liked living too much. The goblin followed Cedar back to their campsite. His master didn't go back to their normal routine of chores, though. He didn't even start doing something exciting for Harad. He just collapsed down onto one of the cut-up logs beside the fire pit they used as chairs, with his head in his hands again. That was no fun. Black Nail just stood there for a few minutes as he waited for his master to do something, but Cedar didn't move. The goblin didn't know what was going on. He tilted his head to the side as he examined his master and tried to figure it out. Maybe his master was afraid of the ghouls? Black Nail gave his master a closer look. No, that didn't seem right. Cedar looked almost sad. Had someone stolen his food? That was what made Black Nail sad, but that didn't seem right either. Cedar had plenty of food stored away. Well, Black Nail had no intention of just standing around forever. The goblin walked over and sat beside his master. Black Nail leaned against his master's leg as he relaxed and got comfortable. Several seconds later, the goblin felt a hand lightly pat him on the head. It felt nice. He glanced up to see Master looking down at him with a resigned expression. Black Nail's master had never patted him on the head before. That was more Geralt's thing. Black Nail really wished he knew what was going on. He was starting to grow concerned. She might just do it, Cedar remarked unhappily as he stared off into space. Black Nail gave him a blank look. He wasn't sure who they were even talking about. Was Cedar talking to him? He was definitely looking right at him, and there was no one else here. Wouldn't that be a great joke, his master added bitterly. After all I've been through and everything that's been lost, Harad might just succeed where I failed. Black Nail thought Harad was probably better than Cedar at a lot of things. His master was obviously better at stuff like hunting though, so it wasn't a big deal. Why was his master so upset? Cedar sighed deeply as he petted Black Nail again. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you, Goblin? Cedar asked him. No ideas, Black Nail replied as he shook his head with a confused expression on his face. Cedar smiled sadly down at the Goblin. There seemed to be more wrinkles around his eyes than normal. My entire life I had one dream. It was the thing I really wanted in life. It's why I became a rebel and an outlaw. Everything I did was to unite the North and free it from the stranglehold of the South. Now here I am, an old washed-up failure, and Harad tells us that she plans to set herself up as bandit queen of what's left of the North. After all these years and so many lives lost, it's Harad that might do it. Harad the Black Snake, a murderous bitch with no allegiance to anyone but herself, Cedar explained as he began to laugh wildly. Black Nail grew alarmed and his eyes widened as he heard Cedar's uncontrolled laughter. His master was acting very weird. The Goblin looked around for someone or something that would calm Cedar down, but he didn't see anything. Desperately, the Goblin started to think. His master was upset because he had failed to get something, and Harad might get it instead. It was a dream, but not like what you saw when you slept. Cedar had said it was something he'd really wanted to do his entire life, and failed. Black Nail didn't have a dream like that. The closest he had to a dream was the stuff in his. The Goblin got up and searched through his pouches. He found the one where he stored the things other people had forgotten about, or left lying around for other people who wanted them more. He reached into it and pulled out the shiniest bits. Black Nail then extended his hands and offered them to Cedar. His master stopped laughing and looked down at him. The old scout slowly reached down and picked the items up to examine them. Some coins, glass beads, paper, and a golden key. Are you trying to cheer me up, Black Nail? He asked the goblin with a surprised tone. Black Nail nodded. Cedar smiled down at him. Where did you get the key from, though? I hope you didn't take it from Herad, he asked. No, master's enemy with the wagons, Black Nail answered with a sly smile. Cedar looked confused for a minute as he tried to figure out what Black Nail meant, but then he smiled broadly. You mean Persis, don't you? You actually stole Persis' chest key. Good boy, serves that bastard right, Cedar cheerfully laughed as he patted the goblin on the head again. Thank you, Black Nail. I'll take the key but you can keep the rest. Now that I'm done feeling sorry for myself, we'd better deal with this ghoul problem, Cedar told him. Black Nail smiled back at his master. He had no idea what his master was trying to say, but he was happy Cedar was no longer upset. Cedar then got to his feet and began to get ready. Black Nail saw him go into his tent and come out carrying a sheathed sword he had never seen before. His master usually used a bow or long knife, not a sword. Cedar drew the sword and held it before himself. Sunlight glinted off the blade as Cedar looked at it with a peaceful but resolved expression on his face. Come, Black Nail. Herad might not be anyone's choice for Queen of the North, but that's fine, because I doubt she cares. So, let's deal with this ghoul infestation and then everyone else who gets in our way, he announced with determination. The old scout sheathed the blade at his waist and walked forward. His steps were heavy with newfound purpose as he once again went forth to fight for his dream. Black Nail sauntered after him. He hoped there would be treats. Honor among thieves 10. Darkness descended upon the Herad's base, and it began to reek of fear, as long as you were a goblin and could actually smell fear anyway. Even the most oblivious humans eventually started to notice the dark atmosphere that was building up. Everyone began to look nervous, and they instinctively joined together into small familiar groups for protection. Herad didn't like it. She wasn't sure if the situation had somehow leaked or if everyone just sensed something was wrong. Whatever the reason though, everyone was clearly not acting normally. Her mood got fouler and she scowled at everyone as she waited for nightfall. She had ordered the watch tripled and had her most trusted men making other preparations as well. These included another huge bonfire in the middle of the camp and a large pit she had some of the bandits digging. The fire was supposedly for a celebration and the pit was officially for storage, but even Black Nail could tell that most the bandits sensed something was off about that explanation. Black Nail also noticed that an unusually high amount of bandits were armed with new-looking spears, and the men that had them were always standing around together. That was more than a little suspicious. The weapons must have come from the hoard that Herad had stolen. Spears were not a popular weapon with the outlaws normally. They were awkward to carry around. Black Nail observed all this with interest from where he was helping dig the pit. He liked digging, but this hole was getting sort of large. It was already deeper than he was tall. As he dug into the earth with his claws and dodged wayward shovel blades, he wondered what they were going to bury in it. Every once in a while the goblin would climb up and peek out of the pit to make sure he wasn't missing anything exciting. Nothing had happened yet, but everyone seemed to be holding their breath nervously and jumping at shadows. Soon, it grew dark enough that it was hard to see, so fires were lit to brighten the clearing. Not only the big bonfire was set aflame, several smaller fires around the clearing were lit as well. Finally, the pit was finished. It had been dug as deep as a man was tall, and was wide enough for a dozen men to squeeze into. After they were done, Cedar and Black Nail wandered over to Herad. The bandit chieftain was standing at one corner of the camp and gazing out into the woods. Around her the sick and wounded were gathered beside a small fire. There were always a few of them around. Some of them recovered, and others didn't. Black Nail could smell the stench of rotting flesh under the sharp tangy smell of various herbs as they approached. So, what do you think? Herad asked Cedar. She didn't turn to look at them, instead she kept scrutinizing the woods at the edge of the clearing. The light from the fires pushed the shadows back all the way to the trees but didn't penetrate them. It's a half-decent plan, as long as you don't mind risking yourself and the wounded, he replied doubtfully. Ah well, I have less to worry about from ghouls than most. The magic that runs through my veins will make sure of that, she answered him as she turned and grinned arrogantly. Don't be overconfident. Even vessels can fall prey to a ghoul's more mundane weapons, he told her. Black Nail thought he sensed a tremor of concern in his voice. Just take your position and wait, old man. If you're worried about me then just make sure you don't shoot me in the back, she replied scornfully as she turned back towards the woods. Cedar then did something unexpected. Instead of his usual farewell grunt he very quickly gave Herad a slight bow, and a humorous grin flashed across his face. As you wish, he told her before spinning around and walking off. Confusion was plain on Herad's face as she gazed after Cedar inquisitively. When her eyes fell across the sword at his hip they widened in surprise, if only for a brief second before she recovered. Black Nail and his master left her there as they headed over to a pile of nearby crates that had been placed under a tarp strung up between several poles. Once there, Cedar took a seat in a shadowed corner, where he could see most of the camp but was hidden from sight. He placed his bow in his lap and went still. Black Nail groaned. He had a pretty good idea where this was going, nowhere. Cedar was obviously laying in wait for something, and it sometimes took hours for his prey to show up. With a sigh, Black Nail sat down next to his master. His mind wandered. They were hunting something, probably those ghoul things. Did that mean the ghouls would be coming right into camp? That seemed very stupid unless ghouls were ridiculously tough, and if that were the case then what good would a bow do? The camp slowly ground to a halt around them. As nervous and afraid as most of the bandits were, the majority of them still weren't going to stay up the entire night. Eventually, the ground was littered with sleeping bodies. Most of them were huddled around brightly lit fires. Herad's extra guards patrolled the border of the camp in large groups. As he sat there, bored out of his mind, Black Nail noticed that they seemed to be avoiding the part of the camp where Herad and the wounded were. Herad herself seemed to be just sitting by the fire and resting. His master had mentioned something about bait. Black Nail sniggered quietly. Were they using Herad as part of the bait? That was ridiculous. No beast could possibly be stupid enough to go after Herad. That would just be suicide, but if they did try it then it would certainly be amusing. Black Nail yawned and thought about trying to sleep, but he quickly decided against it. He wanted to stay up and see these ghoul things, and Cedar would probably just wake him up anyway. That's what he usually did when they went hunting. As the campfires began to die down, Black Nail watched a group of bandits emerge from the dark woods and stroll over to the wounded area without much interest. He was beginning to think nothing exciting would ever happen, until the sound of cloth shifting from behind startled him. Cedar had leaned forward and was watching the new group of bandits very carefully. He slowly prepped his bow. Black Nail's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he threw another look at the group of approaching men. They seemed normal, and were probably just coming back from relieving themselves in the forest or something. At least that's what he thought at first, but as they moved closer to the dimming light of the fires, Black Nail began to notice several oddities. Their clothes were very similar to the rough and dirty outfits most the bandits wore, but they were in even worse shape. It was hard to notice in the darkness, but these men were wrapped in little more than rags. Maybe these bandits had been attacked, and that was why they were headed to the wounded area. That might explain Cedar's interest in them. The next odd thing the goblin noticed was how the men were weirdly in sync. It was subtle, they moved like they were aware of each other at all times, like a pack of predators, or even one single being. Humans didn't move like that, Black Nail realized with a shock. The things that looked like men were almost upon the wounded now. A small gust of wind blew past Black Nail, and brought a new scent with it. It smelled human but also of sickness. Black Nail realized that the scent had been around for a while, but he hadn't recognized it before now. It had been too slight. Not men. Black Nail whispered nervously to Cedar. His master apparently believed him because he nodded and strung an arrow to his bow. Then, he rose to his feet and sighted on one of the things. The call of a nightbird issued from Cedar's lips mere moments before an arrow flew from his bow. The arrow hissed through the air and impaled itself into the chest of one of the man-things, knocking it down to the ground with a hollow slapping sound. Soon, another dozen arrows leapt out of the darkness towards their targets. Cedar's bird call had been the signal to attack. The sudden shower of arrows fell upon the things Black Nail assumed to be ghouls. Arrows slammed into the ghouls' bodies and heads. Most of them fell to the ground and twitched. Black Nail was actually sort of disappointed. He had been expecting something much more exciting to happen. This was too easy. Then, the ghouls began to pull themselves back up onto their feet. The arrows sticking out from their bodies didn't stop them, or even slow them down. One after another, the thin ragged figures rose. A cacophony of inhuman hisses filled the air, as the now obviously inhuman creatures burst forward towards their targets with unnatural speed. The nearby bandits and the wounded shouted fearfully in alarm. Herad rose to meet them from where she had been hidden among the injured. Her sword leapt into her right hand as a long dagger appeared in the other. Her black cloak flapped behind her and her blades flashed through the air as she lunged forward to intercept the ghouls. Beside Black Nail, Cedar cursed and leapt to his feet, as he drew his own blade. The goblin heard other outlaws react behind him. There are more of the bloody damned things than we thought, Cedar spat angrily as he rushed towards the ghouls. Black Nail tentatively followed his master from a few paces back. It wasn't that he was scared, obviously, he just didn't want to get in the way. Ahead of them, Herad had engaged the ghouls in a lightning-fast melee. She danced around them in their wild attacks. Her blade sliced into them and sent spurts of unsettling black blood into the air, but she didn't seem to be doing any real damage to the creatures. They just kept coming. There were 7 ghouls and only 4 of them were armed with any sort of weapon. 2 had swords, 1 wielded a long dagger, and 1 clumsily swung a lumber axe around. The unarmed ones seemed perfectly happy to attack with their bare hands, and they made up for their lack of skill with pure speed and inhuman ferocity. As Black Nail followed Cedar closer, he got a better look at Herad's assailants. Every one of them was skinny and their exposed skin was a pale wormy white that reminded him of maggot flesh. The hoods and scarves that had been covering their faces had fallen from several of them as they fought, to reveal hairless heads and horribly gaunt faces with black eyes empty of everything but mad hunger. The ghouls kept throwing themselves forward in a ravenous berserk rage, while ignoring any damage they took in the progress. Herad ducked under a wild axe's swing to counter with a knife stab to her opponent's chest. She had to quickly withdraw though, as another ghoul came up from her other side and slashed at her with its rusty dagger. She threw herself back to avoid the blow but ended up off balance and too close to another ghoul. Its jaws stretched wide as it screamed ravenously and swung a clawed hand at her face. The blow connected and sent her spiraling across the earth. While the creatures appeared to be unthinking berserkers, they fought so well together they almost seemed to be in formation. The pack of ghouls split in 2 as 3 of them circled Herad and the other 4 broke off and made a dash for the injured and sick. Those of the wounded who could move were now running, but not all of them were so lucky. Screams of terror and pain filled the night as the ghouls tore through the wounded bandits. Herad pulled herself to her feet as she eyed the ghouls circling her. She raised her dagger hand to wipe her face, and scowled as it came away covered in blood. She had a bloody gash down the side of her face. The bandit chieftain spat towards the closest ghoul, raised her weapons, and then threw herself back into the fight. By this time Cedar had reached the ghouls who were feasting upon the still twitching corpses of the injured. They were between him and Harad. He rushed over and launched a series of slashes at a ghoul that was bent over and stuffing its mouth full of bloody human flesh. His attack only gave the pale monstrosity a few superficial cuts and forced it to take a step back. Then all at once, the nearby ghouls hissed, and rose from where they had been frantically eating their grisly meals to face him. Luckily for him, the closest patrol and Vorsha were right behind him. The spearmen drove the ghouls back as the creatures all tried to rush Tay Old Scout. The bandits thrust their spears forward all together. A wall of iron blade tips pushed the outnumbered creatures back. Half the ghouls almost immediately ended up impaled on several long spears that held them in place. The other two made it through. The first ghoul knocked a spear aside and leaped over the rest in a frightening lunge attack, but Vorsha was ready and her spear punched right through its chest before it could land. She then swung the stunned airborne ghoul around and slammed her spear's tip into a nearby barrel. The ghoul flailed and spat, but was stuck and couldn't move. As the second ghoul attacked, a bandit shoved his spear tip through its guts. It kept coming. The creature started pulling itself up the now black and bloody spear shaft to get at the weapon's wielder. The seemingly unstoppable ghoul was finished off when Cedar brought his blade down in a two-handed swing that cleaved into its neck. The creature shuddered violently and vomited up black blood that smelled like putrid meat. Then, it went limp. Meanwhile, Harad was desperately trying to keep the other three ghouls at bay. She had broken out of their encirclement but had to constantly keep moving and attacking to prevent them from regaining it. The bandit chieftain had also managed to disable the arm of one ghoul with a heavy strike, and it now hung uselessly at the ghoul's side. Another limped as it chased after her and black blood oozed from a deep cut on its thigh. However, it was clear that she was getting slower while the ghouls appeared incapable of pain or exhaustion. They just kept coming and would eventually drag her down. Cedar looked up from where he was fighting and saw that Harad was in trouble. He stepped back from the spearman and moved over to get a clearer view. He then sheathed his sword and took up the bow he had across his back. Carefully he set up a shot. As the uninjured ghoul fighting Harad stopped to screech, Cedar's arrow took it through the side of the head. It fell over and began to flop around on the ground like a huge desiccated maggot. That left Harad fighting only the two injured ghouls. She whirled in to attack the ghoul with only one working arm from its vulnerable side, before the limping ghoul could catch up. Her sword bit into its undefended neck, and black blood sprayed out as it collapsed. The limping ghoul then lunged at her in an attempt to catch her off balance. Harad saw it coming and whipped her dagger through the air and into the ghoul's eye socket. It screamed and shuddered for a few seconds before stepping forward to resume its attack. That was all the time Harad needed. She turned, drew another dagger, and then unleashed a whirlwind of slashes at the last ghoul. It tried to ignore them and charge her but Harad slid easily out of its way. The massive little cuts all over its body and the knife embedded in its eye began to wear the ghoul down. It faltered and Harad's sword tore its throat out. The pale creature started twitching but remained upright as it gazed malevolently at Harad. Blood gushed from its torn throat as it launched itself at Harad yet again. She dodged to the side, as the ghoul collapsed mid-leap. Now, none of the creatures were left standing. Harad slowed and stopped moving. She was breathing heavily and the gash down her cheek was bleeding steadily. She stared at the three disabled ghouls on the ground in front of her for a few seconds to make sure they weren't going to get back up. She then groaned and dropped her weapons. Well, that's the easy part out of the way, she told Cedar, as he ran up and tossed her a bag of medical supplies. The scout grunted in reply and she began wiping herself off and applying a salve to her face. Once she was done Harad ordered the spearmen to keep everyone away from what was left of the ghouls. Black Nail tried to get a closer look at the remains but the spearmen shooed him away. The goblin wasn't too upset, the creature's mangled bodies smelled really bad anyway. Harad then had some of her men use their spears to push the ghouls onto a tarp, and had the tarp dumped into the pit Black Nail had helped dig. Everything touched by the ghouls or their blood was thrown in the pit. This included clothes, even Harad's. She stripped off her leathers and threw them in as well. Black Nail got a brief glimpse of a thin, muscular, and scarred body for a second before Vorsha draped a clean cloak over her boss' shoulders and handed her some new clothes. Damned ghouls. I like that armor. At least we shouldn't have to worry about further infection now, Harad cursed. True, but we still have to worry about those already infected. Those ghouls probably already infiltrated the camp several times before they got hungry enough to start abducting people, Cedar responded. He then cast a disturbed look towards the remains of the wounded who had been used to lure the ghouls out. He clearly didn't like that they had been used as bait. What about you? How do I know you are not infected? Harad asked him with an upraised eyebrow. I always carry a flask of powdered silver and garlic extract on me just for occasions like this, Cedar replied. Expensive and paranoid, I approve. If I wasn't already immune I would have to steal it from you, Harad said as she flashed him a quick grin. That's the only reason I told you. Just don't ask me to share. I barely have enough for myself, he said. That's too bad. Here I was hoping to skip this next part, she responded as she began walking towards the center of the camp. I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Cedar told her. We're still going to have to lock the camp down and isolate everyone as much as possible. You won't know who is infected until the disease progresses enough that silver and garlic start burning them, and even then you have worry about the turned breaking out and spreading the disease further. How many ghoul attacks have you seen, Cedar? Harad asked him with sudden curiosity. 3 now, and that's far too many, he answered with a scowl. Black Nail was trailing his master. They walked by a group of shocked-looking bandits who were seated around a fire. The goblin was glad to be away from the creepy ghoul things. They didn't act like animals at all. Black Nail took a deep breath of clean air to calm himself, but sneezed violently when an unwelcome scent tickled his nose. Instinctively, he turned to look at one of the nearby bandits and began sniffing. Curious now, he moved closer to get a better scent. Cedar stopped and gave the goblin an inquiring look. What are you doing, Black Nail? He asked the goblin. Smell ghouls, Black Nail replied as he gazed intently at one man who was sitting nearby. The bandit was now staring back at Black Nail with a very concerned look on his face. Before the man could say anything though, Harad walked over and gave him a look. The man wilted under her attention. It was impressive how without even speaking she could give orders, like shut up or I'll stab you. You can smell infection, she asked the goblin. It was the first time she had ever addressed Black Nail directly. The goblin froze as he suddenly became the center of everyone's undivided attention. The bandit chieftain's dark stare was making him very uncomfortable and upsetting his stomach. He smelled little like ghoul, the startled goblin replied, and Harad smiled viciously at his response. Well now, I guess you've finally made yourself useful, she told him. A pleased Harad quickly had Black Nail tour the camp and sniff everyone. If someone smelled wrong, or if Black Nail just didn't like them, several of Harad's goons dragged them away. The infected were isolated until they could be tested. Archers were put into position around the infected zone to kill them from a distance if they tried anything. None of them did. Harad made it plain what would happen to people who tried to run, and no one wanted to test her. Eventually, the disease progressed enough that the bandits could be tested. Black Nail watched with interest as a small silver knife was applied to their skin. The flesh of the infected burned and rose into red welts at its touch. Then came the killing, the burned couldn't be saved. Harad either decapitated them or they were brought down by archers as they tried to flee. Their corpses were then thrown into the pit along with stacks of firewood. As everyone watched in silence, a stone-faced Harad dropped a torch in the hole. Roaring flames burst out and consumed all trace of the dead. The camp was quiet and morose for several days after that. Between the raid on the weapon caravan and the ghoul attack, the population of the camp had been drastically reduced. Many of the bandits had lost friends or comrades, some of them had even taken a hand in their friends' deaths. There were exceptions to this, though. As usual, Harad revealed no attachment to anyone but herself, and Cedar thought most of the bandits were scum anyway. Oddly enough, these events caused Black Nail to make some new friends. A few of the sick had been identified early enough that they were able to cure themselves with powdered silver and garlic. Without the goblin's warning they would have never known they were infected. Black Nail thus became popular with several bandits. They even began sneaking him treats, and he started putting on weight. Not only was he getting yummy food, but he also started to feel like a real member of the tribe. Harad herself had told him he was useful. She never told anyone that. Then one night, Black Nail the goblin curled up and went to sleep next to his master's tent for the last time. Interlude, Ember in Ashes. Cedar woke from sleep feeling tired and sore, which he supposed just meant he hadn't grown any younger overnight. The ground was hard beneath him even with a blanket between him and it, but he had become used to the feeling over the years. He had spent so many nights sleeping on the earth that softness now seemed alien and uncomfortable to him. He opened his eyes to see the morning light slipping through the cloth walls of his small cozy tent. With a grunt and a not inconsiderable act of will, he tossed his blankets off and quickly got dressed. That done, he took a small sip of water from the canteen beside his bed. His mouth was always dry in the morning. His morning ritual complete, Cedar flipped open the flap of his tent and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. As was usual lately, the sight of the outlaw camp greeted him as he looked around. Once he was sure no one was close, he let out a small sigh of fatigue before forcing himself to get his gear together for this morning's hunt. He just didn't have the energy he used to have. A lot of people called Cedar an old man, but he knew he wasn't one, even if he was just barely the oldest person around. It was simply that his lifestyle had aged him, and kept demanding more from him when he had little left to give. He had seen somewhere around 40 winters, but had forgotten the exact amount. In his youth he had known many men and women over that age and well beyond it, but they were rare out in the wilds. He refused to let himself give in to misery though. Out here in the green was exactly where he wanted to be. In his youth he had loved the forest and that feeling had never left him. He could not think of a better place to live and die than the wilds of the north. Cedar's heart fluttered slightly and his soul stirred as he remembered recent events. The dream he had thought long dead had shown the tiniest bit of life again after all these years. Hope, it seemed, could do what all else couldn't, make him feel young again. As Cedar looked around he spotted Black Nail sleeping in his usual spot, and a small smile crept onto his face. The goblin had dug himself a shallow dirt bed and was hidden under his blanket. Black Nail had sure been a great find. When he had first seen the little beast he had just thought he might be useful for carrying things and such. Cedar was past the point where he wanted to be dragging carcasses through the woods for half a day. He wasn't about to ask one of the other scouts for aid though, he could still keep up just fine by himself. He didn't need other people's help just because he was getting older. After Cedar had taken him in, Black Nail had quickly proven to be so much more than just a porter. First, he had impressed Cedar with his intelligence and how swiftly he had learned. He had shown he could do almost any simple task that Cedar took the time to teach him. Then the goblin had shown far more loyalty and discipline than Cedar had thought goblins were capable of. Cedar had thought the goblin would try to run before a few days were up, and with as much of his stuff as the goblin could carry. That hadn't happened, instead the goblin had clearly become attached to him. Sure, Black Nail might be kind of ugly and cowardly, but he had also shown his loyalty beyond a doubt. Cedar didn't know what he would do if the little guy wasn't around anymore. The old man walked over and gave Black Nail a kick to wake him up. Black Nail however didn't stir. Cedar frowned. This was unusual, the goblin always at least turned to look at Cedar when his master woke him each morning. Cedar gave him a harder kick. Black Nail still didn't move. With newfound concern Cedar reached down and pulled the blanket free from the goblin's form. It snagged on something and wouldn't come free though. Cedar gave it a little twist and it came off. The blanket had gotten stuck on Black Nail's little horns, that was all. It was nothing to worry about. His horns. Misery and bloody damnation. Corotus drown you in vile darkness, you miserable bastards. Cedar swore vehemently as he punched the air and shook with rage. Swearing was hardly unusual in the bandit camp, but Cedar's tirade drew the attention of everyone within earshot. He got quite a few concerned looks and several laughs. Cedar didn't give damn what the people around him thought, but he forced himself to calm down, and chided himself for using a god's name in a curse. That was terribly bad luck, and would only make things worse. Suppressing his rage and his unacknowledged fear, Cedar threw the blanket back down over the goblin and stomped off to find Harad. He really didn't want to speak to Harad though, she had always, no, this wasn't the time for that. Cedar focused and pressed onwards. He made his way to Harad's commandeered farmhouse and marched up to the door. The usual 2 guards were there in front of it. Cedar didn't have the patience to deal with them. Move or I'll shoot you, he growled as he stomped towards them. The 2 men's eyes went wide in surprise and they hurriedly stepped out of his way. Cedar wondered why Harad even bothered with them. They were obviously useless as guards. Knowing Harad, she probably just wanted to keep them away from anything important. One of them spoke out as he moved out of the way. She's not actually in there, Cedar. She went to find Red Dog, the startled man told him. Cedar glowered at him from where he was standing in front of the door with one hand ready to knock. He huffed and then turned back the way he had come. The stupid ruffians should have mentioned that Harad was out right away, instead of wasting his time. Cedar turned around and started walking again. He thought Red Dog's lean-to was over by the south end of the camp, so he headed that way. He didn't even have a bow, one of the bandits remarked as Cedar stomped off. Cedar realized they were right, he could have sworn he had strapped it to his back earlier. Well, it wasn't like he needed a bow to show those brutes who was boss anyway. Right now he had much more important things to do. He passed several groups of early risers cooking or just sitting around their campfires as he headed across the camp. When he got close to Red Dog's side he looked ahead and saw Harad talking to Red Dog and Vorshaw. Geralt was standing in the background being a useless lump and following Vorshaw around as usual. That stupid young man didn't realize what it took to survive out in the north. Red Dog saw him coming and said something to Harad. She turned to look at Cedar as he approached. She mustn't have liked the look on his face because she grimaced at him. Vorshaw also gave Cedar a confused look. Bah, what did he care what they thought? Cedar walked over to them without saying anything. Now that he was here he was a little lost for words. He wasn't quite sure what would be the best way to say what he wanted. As he thought it over, Harad gave him an exasperated look. What's got up your backend, Cedar? She asked him rudely. Cedar glowered at her. He was having trouble controlling his emotions. It's about Black Nail, he hesitantly answered. Harad waved him off. Yes, he's made himself quite useful. You can keep the goblin. I'll even lay off about that stupid promise of yours about Warwick, she replied dismissively. Cedar froze in surprise. No, that's not what I was saying. I can't keep the goblin because, he started to say, but Harad interrupted him with an annoyed look. You can't seriously be telling me that now you want to get rid of him, she asked in disbelief. Everyone around them also looked confused or surprised. No. I can't keep the goblin because I no longer have one, Cedar explained. This just earned him more confused looks. He ran off. Vorshaw asked at the same time. Gerlod yelled, You killed him. Cedar scowled at them. These people were idiots. Listen Cedar, just come out and say it. Oh, and if you are playing some sort stupid game here where you are trying to make me ask you to keep the goblin, then I will stab you. Are we clear? Harad told him with an annoyed tone. Cedar took a second to gather his thoughts before responding. He decided to be thorough in his answers so there would be no more stupid questions, or stabbings. He knew he was too useful for Harad to kill, but that didn't mean she couldn't hurt him. She would undoubtedly enjoy it. Black Nail wouldn't wake up this morning, plus he's growing horns. That means he's gone into a sort of hibernation that goblins go into when they're transforming into hobgoblins, he explained carefully. Everyone's reaction to this news was different. Harad's face instantly went blank, so Cedar had no idea what she was thinking. Vorshaw looked confused, while Geralt looked excited, and Red Dog had a horrified expression on his face. Cedar scowled and waited for them to start asking him dumb questions. I thought goblins and hobgoblins were two different things, Vorshaw said first. It was Geralt that answered her. No, hobgoblins are a rare and usually latent adult form of goblins. No one is quite sure what causes the transformation to occur when it's obviously not needed for breeding, but it's a fascinating question. Some salamanders do something similar, he explained enthusiastically as Vorshaw threw him an amused look. He's transforming because you kept sneaking him treats. I had him on a diet for this very reason, you idiot, Cedar told the now guiltily flushing young man. Cedar knew he was partly to blame because he had stopped enforcing that rule lately, but he would never admit it. He had even noticed Black Nail was putting on weight and hadn't done anything about it because he had gotten too attached to the goblin. That was stupid. Hey, I guess that means little Black Nail is growing up, Vorshaw commented. What it means is that we need to kill him, Red Dog told them angrily. Geralt had looked shocked at his words, but Cedar had known this was coming. If Red Dog didn't say it, then over half the camp was still sure to. Hobgoblins were very far from popular. I need? Watch your language, Harad told Red Dog with a raised eyebrow. He paused and then hastily rephrased himself. We should kill him. Hobgoblins are bloody dangerous. They're killers that would rather slit a man's throat than look at them. There's a reason most countries have a bounty on their ugly green heads. Evil and ruin follow them. Taking one for a pet would be like taking a sea serpent for a mount. It can only end one way, he exclaimed angrily. Harad's face was still blank and unrevealing. She seemed content to let the others speak, and Cedar wanted to wait and see what the others thought before saying anything himself. Geralt huffed condescendingly at Red Dog. That's nothing but myth and superstition. It's leftover nonsense from the Goblin Wars, which weren't even real wars. They just involved the early colonists killing a whole lot of goblin tribes as they cleared the land. As for the bounty, well, there's a bigger bounty on your head, Red Dog. Also, you kill people all the time and you don't see me being all terrified of you, Geralt argued. I can take a hobgoblin easy, Vorsha added as she stood tall and crossed her arms in front of her. Red Dog ignored her and turned to Geralt. Don't give me that scholar crap, city boy. I've actually fought a hobgoblin before and it killed a good friend of mine. If you had actually ever been anywhere near one before, then you would be dead. No one here should even be considering letting one into camp. They're accursed savage fiends. That's even what hob means, it means demon. Red Dog replied as his face grew red with anger. That shows the worth of your so-called knowledge, Red Dog. Hob comes from an old imperial word for home. The original settlers called them hobgoblins because they were more tribal than normal goblins, and would occasionally build their own shelter. It was only after the Goblin Wars that ignorant people, like you, begun to associate them with demons, Geralt explained to Red Dog, as the man grew angrier. Red Dog looked like he was about to explode and take Geralt out with him, but Harad intervened. What do you want to do, Cedar? She asked him plainly. Cedar wished he had some idea of what she was thinking, but she had always been a mystery to him in every situation that didn't immediately lead to violence. He sighed. The easiest thing would be to get rid of Black Nail, maybe they could leave him out in the woods somewhere instead of killing him. There were a bunch of problems with that though, like what would stop him from just coming right back. Cedar knew he couldn't bring himself to kill Black Nail either. I can control him. It won't be a problem, he heard himself say, much to his own surprise. Red Dog scowled at him but Cedar just scowled back, and he had far more experience at it. This is a terrible idea. They eat people. Red Dog yelled. It's just one hobgoblin, Red. Do you really think something even smaller than you is so scary? Vorsha asked him teasingly. And as if Black Nail would hurt us. Geralt added. Cedar tried not to wince at the young man's naivety. Hobgoblins were dangerous, but then again everyone in this camp was. When Geralt had finally got himself killed, it was much more likely to be another bandit that did it rather than anything else. Why is he even involved in this conversation? He's a rookie, and a stupid one, Red Dog asked as he pointed to Geralt. Cedar thought he actually had a good point there but kept his mouth shut. Geralt was being a useful idiot this time around. Fine, I've decided, Harad announced before anyone else could say something. Cedar can keep Black Nail, as long as he manages to keep him under control. That nose of his is useful enough to be worth a little risk, but one incident and he's gone. Cedar felt a wave of relief wash over him, and let out a deep relaxed breath. He had been unsure of what Harad would decide, she had never been predictable. When he had seen Black Nail's horns that morning he had known right away that he had a very good chance of losing his pet. With the discussion over, Red Dog and Geralt had started arguing, as Harad stepped away and spoke with Vorsha. Having accomplished his goal, Cedar headed back to his campsite to check on Black Nail. He really didn't feel like more conversation and he had lots to do, especially now that Black Nail wouldn't be around to help out for a while. Of course, now that he had gotten Harad's permission to keep Black Nail, he had to actually come up with some way to do what no one had ever accomplished before, tame a hobgoblin. Cedar sighed. He had a feeling it was going to be a long and dangerous job. No matter what, Geralt had naively believed hobgoblins had a bad reputation for good reasons. They were cunning and they were bloodthirsty, and that combination of traits had been the end of many men. A hobgoblin might not be quite as strong as a man and far weaker than a troll or ogre, but neither of those would track a man unseen through the woods for miles and cut his throat when his guard was down. They also wouldn't lure someone into a well-prepared ambush by a pack of goblins. Cunning could be far more dangerous than brute strength sometimes. Taming one would not be easy, even if it was Black Nail. When he woke up, the former goblin would have a lot of new instincts clamoring around in his head that would make him hard to keep under control. Hobgoblins were aggressive and territorial, so getting one to obey orders would be tricky. It would definitely be a challenge, but Cedar intended to meet it. The price of failure wasn't acceptable, and besides he had never accomplished anything like it before. No one had, and that was what made it interesting. Cedar reached his campsite and looked down at Black Nail. The little green goblin was still lying there without moving, but his chest was definitely rising and falling as he breathed. The wind had blown his blanket off, so Cedar got a good look at him. As he had noticed before, two tiny horns were starting to grow from Black Nail's skull, and the recent weight he had put on was disappearing as the goblin consumed it to feed his growth. He already seemed noticeably taller to Cedar's eyes, and Cedar knew he would be growing quite a bit more over the next few days. Cedar sighed in exasperation. Black Nail was certainly causing him a lot of trouble. Having a hobgoblin around was going to piss quite a few people off. The goblin was supposed to make his life easier, not harder. He was definitely going to have to work Black Nail even harder than normal, once he woke up, to make up for it. Alright then, Black Nail, you stupid little beast, if you're going to be of any use to me at all later I can't just leave you here outside in the weather, Cedar mumbled as he reached down and gently picked the goblin up. He then carried him into his tent where it would be warmer and Black Nail could sleep undisturbed until Cedar could arrange some better shelter of his own.